I didn't even look up. 7 years of marriage, 7 years of Sunday mornings, of arguments about money, of hands held in hospital waiting rooms, of a woman who rearranged her entire life around a man who was already planning his exit. And when the moment finally came, when the pen hit the table and the papers were slid across the desk, Adrian Mercer didn't even have the decency to look at her face. He just signed. What Lillian Hayes was carrying in her purse that morning would have changed everything. But watching those cold, indifferent eyes stay fixed on the page, she made a decision that would shape the next 6 years of both their lives. She said nothing. If you've ever loved someone who made you feel invisible, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will leave you breathless. Hit the like button, drop a comment with your city or country so we can see how far this story travels, and make sure you're subscribed so you never miss what's coming next. Now, let's begin. The pen was expensive. That was the first thing Lillian noticed, a heavy, matte black thing that probably cost more than her first month's rent, in the apartment she'd shared with Adrian back when they were still young enough to think love was enough to survive on. He'd bought it sometime in the last year, along with the new watch, the new car, the new leather chair in the office she was no longer welcome in. Adrian Mercer was very good at replacing things. He uncapped the pen without ceremony, flipped to the first flagged page, and signed his name in one clean, practiced stroke, like he'd been rehearsing. Lillian sat across from him at the long conference table inside Hargrove and Associates, her hands folded in her lap, her back straight, her face arranged into the careful blankness she'd spent the last 4 months learning to wear. Her own attorney, a tired-looking woman named Sandra Chu, sat to her left and said nothing. There was nothing left to say. The negotiations were finished. The division of assets, the sale of the condo, the settlement, all of it had been hammered out in prior meetings that felt less like legal proceedings and more like two strangers dividing up the contents of a storage unit, which, she supposed, was what their marriage had eventually become. Adrian flipped to the second page, signed again. His attorney, a sharp-jawed man named Kellerman, who always smelled faintly of cigarettes, murmured something approving and slid the next page forward. Lillian watched her husband's profile, the strong jaw, the slight furrow between his brows that appeared whenever he was concentrating, the way his shoulders sat square and composed inside that charcoal suit. She had loved those shoulders once, had pressed her face against them during a thunderstorm the first winter they were together, when they'd lost power for 3 days and thought the whole thing was romantic instead of miserable. She had kissed the back of his neck in the kitchen on ordinary mornings before either of them was fully awake, back when ordinary felt like enough. She did not cry. She had made a deal with herself that morning, standing in the bathroom of the small rental she'd moved into 3 months earlier, no tears in front of him. Not because she wanted to seem strong, but because she knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that tears would not move Adrian Mercer. They would only make him uncomfortable, and his discomfort would harden into irritation, and she was so exhausted from that particular cycle that she'd rather feel nothing in front of him than give him the chance to make her feel worse. Her purse sat on the chair beside her. Inside it, folded in half, was a white paper bag from the pharmacy 2 blocks away. Inside that bag was a small cardboard box. Inside that box was a plastic test she'd taken at 6:30 that morning in the bathroom of the rental apartment, gripping the edge of the sink while she waited, telling herself it was going to be negative. Of course it would be negative, because the universe did not operate with that kind of timing. It simply did not. 2 lines. She had sat on the edge of the tub for 11 minutes. She knew because she watched the numbers on her phone change. She didn't think. She didn't plan. She simply sat there while something enormous moved through her chest like weather. Then she'd gotten up, washed her hands, put the test back in the box, put the box back in the bag, put the bag in her purse, and driven to the lawyer's office to watch her husband sign away their marriage with the same focused calm he brought to closing a business deal. He turned to the final page now. Sandra Chu leaned slightly toward Lillian and whispered, "Once he signs this one, you'll both need to initial the bottom." Lillian nodded. Adrian's pen moved across the last signature line. He set the pen down, aligned it parallel to the top of the document. A small, unconscious gesture, the kind of thing you noticed after 7 years, and finally looked up. Their eyes met. She had imagined this moment before, had played it in her head in different versions. Sometimes she cried, Sometimes she said something cutting, sometimes she simply looked at him until he flinched. But the version she hadn't prepared for was this one. The version where he looked at her with something that was almost regret, and then it was gone, replaced almost instantly by that polished executive composure. And she realized she had no idea anymore whether the man across the table was capable of sustaining an honest feeling for more than 3 seconds. Lillian. His voice was quiet. Not cold exactly, just managed. Adrian. Kellerman slid the initialing sheet toward him. He initialed. Sandra slid the matching copy toward Lillian. She uncapped her own pen, a regular ballpoint from the bottom of her bag, and initialed beside his. Their initials sat next to each other on the line, LH and AM. Like strangers who happened to be standing in the same spot, Kellerman gathered the papers with brisk efficiency. We'll file these with the court this afternoon. You should both receive confirmation within 10 business days. Adrian stood first. He buttoned the middle button of his jacket, a gesture so reflexive it clearly required no thought. He extended his hand across the table. Lillian looked at the hand for a moment. Then she shook it. His grip was firm and brief. Business grip, same as he gave clients. I hope you find what you're looking for, he said. And she understood from his tone that he meant it sincerely, the same way you might sincerely wish a departing colleague good luck with their next position. She picked up her purse, felt the small weight of the pharmacy bag inside, felt the way that weight seemed to hum against her ribs like something alive. I already know what I'm looking for, she said. He nodded, as if that were a satisfying answer, and turned toward the door. She watched him go. His attorney followed. The door swung closed, and the room was just Lillian and Sandra and the hum of the ventilation system and the particular silence that fills the space where a marriage used to be. Sandra put a hand briefly on Lillian's forearm. You did great. It's over. Lillian nodded, picked up her coat, walked out into the corridor, then into the elevator, then out through the glass lobby doors and into the October air, which was sharp enough that it almost felt like something was trying to wake her up. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. She did not reach for her phone, did not call her sister or her best friend or her mother. She just stood there with her hand on the strap of her purse over the spot where the pharmacy bag sat inside, and she breathed in the cold air and thought about what Adrian had looked like in the moment before the composure came back. That flicker, whatever it was. Then she walked to her car and she drove home, and she sat in the parking lot of her rental apartment for 40 minutes before she trusted herself to go inside. She never told him. In the months that followed, people were kinder than she expected and less helpful than she needed. Her sister Diane drove up from Baltimore the week after the filing and spent 3 days arranging Lillian's kitchen, which was her way of expressing love. And Lillian let her because she didn't have the energy to explain that what she actually needed was someone to sit on the floor with her and not say anything useful. Her mother called every Sunday and asked questions that were well-intentioned and subtly devastating. Her friends from the early years of the marriage, the couples mainly, fell away with the quiet inevitability of water finding its level, because couples tend to align with whichever half of a divorced pair they can most easily imagine themselves being, and most of them had quietly decided Adrian was more useful to know. None of them knew about the pregnancy. Lillian didn't tell anyone until she was showing, and by then it was January, and the decision about Adrian had already solidified in her chest into something she no longer questioned. She had thought about it, exhaustively. In the weeks after the divorce was finalized, she had gone over it from every angle. Lying awake at 2 in the morning, driving to work, grading spelling tests with one hand while her other hand rested on the small, barely there roundness at her abdomen. She had thought about what it would mean to call him. She had thought about what his face might do if she said the words. She had thought about Adrian Mercer's track record with inconvenient information, which was to manage it, and about Adrian Mercer's track record with things that demanded emotional availability, which was to reroute around them. She thought about what kind of life a child has when one of their parents is there only because they felt obligated. She had grown up with an obligated parent. She knew what that felt like from the inside. She chose her son's name early, Caleb. She didn't know yet that it was a boy. She wouldn't find out for another 6 weeks. But the name had floated up from somewhere and lodged itself and refused to leave. Caleb Hayes. Her name. Her mother's maiden name. A name that belonged to her side of the story. When the technician confirmed it was a boy, Lillian cried for the first time since the divorce. Not from grief. She was still working out the grammar of grief, still learning where it lived in her body, but from something that felt more like recognition, like meeting someone she already knew. "He's very active," the technician said, watching the screen. "You're going to have your hands full." Lillian laughed, a real one, unexpected, and wiped her eyes with the back of her wrist. "I already do," she said, and she meant it about 18 different ways. She was a second-grade teacher at Elmwood Elementary, which was a fact that had never felt particularly significant until she was pregnant and alone and suddenly understood the precise value of a job with reliable hours, decent health insurance, and colleagues who would cover your class in a genuine emergency. The other teachers, once they found out, which happened in the way these things always happened in a school, through a combination of observation and the complete impossibility of keeping secrets in a building full of people who were professionally trained to notice everything, were fiercely, practically kind in the way that women who have survived difficult things tend to be. They organized a shower. They left food in her mailbox. A fourth-grade teacher named Bev, who had raised 2 kids as a single mother herself, sat across from Lillian in the break room one afternoon in March and said, without any softening, "It's going to be harder than you think it is, but you're going to be better at it than you think you are." It was the most useful thing anyone said to her during the entire pregnancy. Caleb was born in May, 7 pounds 4 ounces, delivered after 11 hours of labor during which Lillian's sister held her hand and swore steadily under her breath in a way that Lillian found oddly comforting. He had a full head of dark hair and a ferocious cry, and a small, indignant face that Lillian looked at for the first time and felt something shift in her chest so fundamentally that she understood certain things would never be in quite the same configuration again. She also understood, looking at that face, why she had not told Adrian. The face was his, not a resemblance, not a suggestion. The face was simply, undeniably, Adrian Mercer's face on a 7-pound baby who hadn't done anything wrong yet. Same jaw, same space between the eyebrows, same expression of focused, slightly impatient assessment that Adrian wore when he was trying to figure out what was happening around him. Lillian held her son and thought, "I made the right choice. I made the only choice." And she believed that most of the time. Caleb was 8 months old when she returned to teaching. The daycare near the school was expensive in the way that all daycare was expensive. A grinding, structural expensiveness that felt designed to make mothers feel that working was almost not worth it. Almost. And Lillian made the numbers work through a combination of her teacher's salary, the divorce settlement she'd been careful with, and a monthly budget that she tracked in a green notebook with the focused attention of someone disarming a bomb. She did not go out. She did not buy things she didn't need. She cooked at home with the determination of someone for whom takeout had become a luxury in the same category as international travel. She was tired in a way that had no real name. Not sleepy, not burned out exactly, but a kind of bone-level tiredness that you carried the same way you carried your keys, because putting it down wasn't currently an option. She made mistakes. She forgot to buy diapers twice and had to borrow from the couple downstairs. She fell asleep on the couch, grading papers with Caleb in the swing beside her, and woke up at midnight with crick in her neck and a half-graded stack of subtraction worksheets. She burned dinner with a frequency that began to feel like a personality trait. She cried sometimes, in the car in the parking lot of the grocery store, with the engine running, because that was the only place where the crying felt contained. But there were other things too. The first time Caleb laughed, a real laugh, a full-body surprised delight. At the sight of a ceiling fan, Lillian stood in the middle of the room and felt something in her chest loosen like a knot finally giving way. The way he grabbed her finger and refused to let go. The way he smelled, that specific baby smell that she'd heard other mothers describe and had always assumed was exaggerated, until she found herself trying to memorize it because she understood it would eventually be gone. The way he looked at her with a focused, total attention that no adult had ever looked at her with, as if she were the most important and interesting phenomenon in his immediate universe, which, she supposed, she was. She found, over the months and then years that followed, that love was not the word for what she felt about Caleb. It was too small. It was like using the word water for the ocean. Meanwhile, across the city, 3.7 miles away, as Lillian would eventually calculate during a strange, sleepless night when she found herself tracking it on a map, Adrian Mercer was building the life he had always told himself he wanted. The 2 years following the divorce saw his investment firm, Mercer Capital Group, expand from a mid-sized regional operation into something with genuine national presence. He opened an office in Chicago. He hired 43 people. He moved from the condo he and Lillian had shared, sold per the settlement, into a 41st floor apartment with a view that his assistant described as commanding, and that Adrian himself rarely looked at because the view wasn't really the point. The point was the work. The point was always the work. He was very good at the work. No one disputed that. He had a particular skill not flashy, not loud, but precise and patient, for identifying what a distressed company actually needed versus what it thought it needed, and for explaining the difference in language that didn't insult the people in the room. His clients trusted him. His staff trusted him. His business partners, the ones who'd worked with him long enough to know his habits, trusted him with the specific contractual trust of people who understood exactly what they were getting and exactly what they were not. What they were not getting was warmth. Adrian Mercer was not cold, exactly. He didn't make people feel dismissed or diminished. He was considerate in a systematic way. He remembered details about people's lives, asked follow-up questions, acknowledged important moments. But there was a distance, a managed remove. The people closest to him, which was not, if he was being precise, very many, learned to understand it as simply a feature of how he was built. The same way you learn to understand that a particular house runs cold in winter and just budget accordingly. Relationships after Lillian did not go well. There was Caroline, a marketing director he dated for 8 months, who ended things by telling him he was emotionally somewhere else, even when he was physically present, which he found both unfair and uncomfortably accurate. There was a brief involvement with a woman named Petra that ended before it really began because she'd said something early on about wanting children within the next few years, and he'd felt something in his chest close off like a valve and had never quite recovered from that response. There were a handful of other situations that proceeded in various ways for various lengths of time and ended with a consistency that he was aware of, but not sure how to interrupt. His mother, Eleanor, called him every Thursday. She lived in Bethesda with his stepfather, a quiet, decent man named Robert, who had perfected the art of being in the room in a way that took up no unnecessary space. Eleanor was 71 and sharp, and not remotely interested in softening her observations about her son's life. "You look tired," she told him on a Thursday evening in October. He was at his office. He was usually at his office. "I'm fine." "You look like you're fine in the way that a man looks fine when he's been running on coffee and denial." That's a specific diagnosis. "I've had a long time to study the subject." She paused. "When did you last go somewhere that wasn't work-related?" He thought about it. "Last spring, I went to..." "Business dinner doesn't count. A client trip doesn't count. I mean, somewhere you went because you wanted to be there." He couldn't answer that. Eleanor let the silence sit for a moment, which was her preferred instrument of emphasis. "Adrian, I'm not trying to get into your business, but you spent 7 years married to a woman who genuinely loved you, and when that became too much to manage, you signed a piece of paper and went back to the office. And here we are." "Mom, I'm not saying you were wrong about everything. I'm saying you might want to examine what you think you're building and whether you're going to want to live in it." He said something deflecting. She let him. They talked about Robert's back and a trip they were planning and his cousin's new baby, and after they hung up, he sat in his office chair for a while longer, looking out at the view his assistant had called commanding. He thought briefly about Lillian. He did that sometimes, not often, not with longing exactly, but with a kind of distant wondering that he'd never fully analyzed. He wondered if she'd stayed in the city or moved away. He wondered if she was doing all right. He wondered, now and then, with a vagueness he deliberately kept vague, whether the way things had ended had been as clean as he'd told himself it had been. Then he picked up a file that needed his attention, and the wondering folded itself away, and the work resumed, because the work was always there when other things weren't. And he had always found that reliable. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea. Caleb Hayes at age 3 was a small, emphatic person who had strong opinions about what color cup his juice came in, who narrated everything he was doing in real time as if providing his own commentary, and who had recently developed an intense and baffling passion for earthworms that Lillian was choosing to interpret as a positive sign of scientific curiosity rather than something to worry about. He started preschool at the church down the street in September of that year, which meant that Lillian was now managing the logistics of 2 school schedules, her own and her son's, while also managing the grocery budget, the laundry, the parent-teacher conferences she attended alone while watching other couples compare notes in the parking lot, and the specific loneliness of being the only adult in an apartment at 10 o'clock on a Friday night. She had told Caleb about his father in the way she'd planned from the beginning, carefully, honestly, and in age-appropriate pieces. His father's name was Adrian. His father didn't live with them. Some families were like that. She kept the picture out of it. The idea of a photograph felt like opening a door she wasn't ready to manage, and kept Adrian as an idea, a fact, a name that existed in the world somewhere, not a monster and not an absence requiring grief, just a fact about their particular family shape. Caleb accepted this with the equanimity of a 3-year-old for whom the category of normal was still being constructed and therefore had plenty of room in it. At 4, he started asking more specific questions. "Does my dad know about me?" Lillian was driving. She kept her eyes on the road. "No," she said. "He doesn't." "Why not?" She thought about this for the length of half a block. "Because sometimes grown-ups make decisions," she said finally. "And those decisions affect other people in ways they don't see coming. And sometimes it's hard to know whether to fix that or whether to leave it alone." Caleb thought about this. He was watching a dog on the sidewalk. "I would want to know," he said. Lillian said nothing. She gripped the steering wheel a little tighter and drove them home. The package sat on Lillian's kitchen table for 3 days before she opened her laptop and started writing. She'd found an address for Mercer Capital Group without much difficulty. Adrian's firm was not hiding. She'd spent a week writing and deleting and rewriting, sitting at the kitchen table after Caleb was in bed with a cup of tea that went cold and the specific paralysis of someone trying to phrase a thing that has no right phrasing. She wrote drafts that were too angry, drafts that were too apologetic, drafts that explained too much, and drafts that explained too little. In the end, the letter she put in the envelope was 3 paragraphs long. She told him the truth without decoration. She told him she had not told him for reasons she still believed were sound, that she was not asking him for anything, that she was giving him this information because both he and their son deserved to have it. She told him about the park. Saturday morning, 11 o'clock. They would be feeding ducks. If he came, he came. If he didn't, she would not reach out again. She folded the letter and put it in the envelope with the photograph. A school picture, Caleb in his green polo shirt, that particular focused expression on his small face, and sealed it and put it in the padded mailer and drove to the post office on a Tuesday morning and stood in line behind a man returning a package and a teenager sending something that rattled. And when she got to the counter, she handed it over and the woman behind the counter put a stamp on it and dropped it in the bin, and that was that. She drove home. She didn't tell Caleb what she'd done. She didn't tell Diane. She didn't tell Bev from the 4th grade. She sat with it alone for the rest of the week, which was how she'd sat with most of it, most of this entire 6 years. And she did her job, and she made dinner, and she helped Caleb build a cardboard rocket ship on Thursday evening that took them 2 hours and fell apart the same night. And she held her son's small, disappointed face in her hands and said, "We can make it stronger tomorrow. We'll know what to do better next time." He looked at her with those eyes. Adrian's eyes, she thought, not for the first time and not for the last. "Okay," he said. "Promise?" "Promise," she said. She meant it about more than the rocket ship. The package arrived on a Wednesday. Adrian's assistant, a capable and unflappable woman named Greta, who had worked for him for 4 years and had developed a finely calibrated sense of what required his immediate attention versus what could wait until Thursday, brought it in with the afternoon mail stack and set it on the corner of his desk without comment. It was a padded mailer, the kind you bought at any post office, with his name and the firm's address written in handwriting he didn't recognize. No return address, a local postmark. He didn't open it immediately. He was on a call with the Chicago office, walking through third-quarter projections with a man named Patterson, who had a tendency to bury the actual problem inside 4 layers of optimistic framing, and Adrian was in the process of excavating the real number from underneath the framing. When his eye caught the mailer and stayed there for a moment in a way he couldn't immediately explain, he looked away, finished the call, made 2 notes on the yellow legal pad he still used because he'd tried the digital alternatives and found them somehow slippery, like they didn't hold the weight of a thought the same way. Then he picked up the mailer. He felt the contents through the padding, something flat, stiff. A photograph, maybe. A card. He turned it over looking for a return address that wasn't there, and something at the base of his spine did a thing he didn't have a name for. Not alarm, exactly. Not recognition. Something in between. He opened it. The photograph came out first because it was on top, and so the photograph was what he saw before he saw anything else, and for approximately 4 seconds, he simply held it and did not think in any language he could access. His brain was receiving the image the way a computer receives a file. It doesn't have the software to open. Processing, nothing. The boy in the photograph was 6 years old. He was wearing a green polo shirt. He was looking directly at the camera with an expression of focused, slightly impatient assessment, the way a person looks when they're being asked to hold still and they're only barely willing to cooperate. Adrian knew that expression. He knew it because he'd seen it in the mirror every day for 41 years. He put the photograph down on his desk with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something that might shatter. He picked up the letter. It was 3 paragraphs. He read it once fast, the way you read something you're hoping will turn out to mean something different than what you're currently understanding. And then he read it again slowly, and then he put it down next to the photograph, and he sat in his 41st floor office with his commanding view and his matte black pen and his 4th quarter projections, and he put both hands flat on the desk, and he breathed. Caleb Hayes, 6 years old. She had known the morning of the divorce. He picked up the phone, put it down, picked it up again. Greta's number was on the screen. He cleared it, put the phone face down on the desk, stood up, which accomplished nothing, sat back down. The photograph was still there. The boy, his son, the word moved through him like a current, was still looking at him with that expression. Patient, slightly skeptical, waiting. Adrian pressed his palms against his eyes until he saw light, and then he took his hands away and looked at the ceiling and thought, with a clarity that felt almost violent, 6 years, 6 birthdays, 6 first days of school, 6 years of a child existing in the world who was half his, who had his face, who had grown from a secret in a pharmacy bag into a 6-year-old boy in a green polo shirt, and he had been 3-point-something miles away building his commanding view and his national presence and closing deals and taking calls from Patterson about 3rd quarter projections. He stood up again. This time he walked to the window. Below him the city moved with its ordinary indifference. Taxis, people, the geometry of streets. He had stood at this window during negotiations, during crises, during the quiet hours after midnight when the office was empty and the work was the only thing that made the shape of his days feel purposeful. He had stood here feeling capable and clear and in control of the trajectory of things. He did not feel any of those things now. He felt like a man who had just walked into a room and found the furniture rearranged into a shape that revealed the room had always been this room. He'd just been standing in the wrong part of it. He went home 2 hours earlier than usual. Greta looked up when he walked past her desk with his jacket and his bag and the padded mailer tucked under his arm, and she had the professional sense to say nothing beyond good night, which was why he valued her. He sat in his apartment, the commanding view dark now, the city lights doing their indifferent glitter, and he read the letter 4 more times. He examined the photograph under the lamp on the side table. He noted, with the systematic attention he brought to everything and that was currently failing him in every way that mattered, the specific architecture of the boy's face, the jaw, the brow, the way the ears sat. He noted that the boy appeared healthy, that the photograph had the particular flat brightness of a school picture, that the boy's polo shirt had a small smudge near the collar that the photographer had not caught or had not cared about. He thought about Lillian standing in the lawyer's office. He thought about her hands folded in her lap, her face arranged into that careful blankness. He had read that blankness at the time as composure, as a woman who had made her peace with the decision and was simply processing the paperwork. He had felt, somewhere beneath the relief of finally moving forward, a small and never-examined guilt about that blankness. And he had managed the guilt the way he managed uncomfortable information, which was to reclassify it as something smaller and put it somewhere he didn't have to look at directly. She had been standing in that office with a pregnancy test in her purse. She had shaken his hand. He put the photograph face down on the coffee table because looking at it was doing something to his chest that he didn't know how to regulate, and he sat in the dark for a long time without turning on any other lights. And at some point he realized his hands were shaking slightly, which was a thing that had not happened to him since he was 19 years old and had gotten a phone call about his father, and the recognition of that physical similarity did not help. He did not sleep that night. Not really. He lay in the bed in the dark, and the ceiling was the ceiling, and the city was the city, and his son, he had a son, the word arrived every time like the first time, was somewhere in this city in an apartment he'd never seen, sleeping in a bed he'd never stood beside, dreaming whatever a 6-year-old dreamed about. He thought about what the letter said about Saturday. The park. 11 o'clock, feeding ducks. He thought, she's giving me a choice. He thought, she doesn't have to. She has been managing this entirely alone for 6 years, and she doesn't have to give me anything. He thought about what kind of man shows up to that park. He thought about what kind of man doesn't. By Friday, he had told no one. Not Greta. Not his business partner, Ray Okafor, who was perceptive enough that he'd noticed Adrian was off and had said so in the blunt, non-intrusive way Ray had, asking once, "You good?" and accepting Adrian's "yeah, just tired" at face value, because Ray understood that some things needed to be volunteered rather than extracted. Not his mother. Especially not his mother. He thought about calling 100 times, and each time he imagined the conversation, Eleanor's silence, then Eleanor's measured, devastatingly accurate assessment of what this meant, and he put the phone down because he wasn't ready to have the thing named out loud by someone else. Not yet. It was still only his, the knowledge, and there was something about that solitude that felt necessary before it became a shared fact in the world. He spent Friday evening doing something he hadn't done in years. He sat on the floor of his apartment, not the couch, the floor, with his back against the couch, and he went through his phone's photo archive looking for pictures of himself at age 6. There were no digital photos from that era, obviously, so what he did instead was look for his mother's number, which he did call, and when Eleanor answered, he said, "Hey, do you have the photo albums, the ones from when I was a kid?" And there was a pause on her end that he felt rather than heard. "Of course I do," she said. "Adrian, what's going on?" "Nothing. I just want to look at some pictures. Can I come by Sunday?" Another pause. "You can come by any time you want, you know that. But you sound strange." "I'm fine." "You're not fine." She said it without heat, just as a statement of observable fact. "But all right, Sunday. I'll make lunch." He said thanks, and hung up and sat on the floor a while longer, which was not a thing he could have explained to anyone. Why the floor specifically, except that the floor felt like the right altitude for the state he was in. Saturday morning came with the particular quality of light that October mornings in the city had, low and gold and slightly skeptical, as if the day itself was reserving judgment. Adrian was awake by 6. He showered, dressed in the kind of clothes he almost never wore, dark jeans, a plain gray sweater, nothing that announced him, and sat at his kitchen counter with coffee he didn't drink and the photograph propped against the fruit bowl in front of him. He left his apartment at 10:15. He drove, even though the park was close enough to walk, because he needed the option to leave, needed the car as an exit if the whole thing became something he couldn't manage. He told himself this practically, without judgment. Then he judged himself for it anyway. He parked on the street outside the park's east entrance at 10:52. He sat in the car for 6 minutes. Then he got out. The park on a Saturday morning in October had the particular population it always had. Joggers, a few dog walkers, a cluster of older men at the chess tables even in the cold. A group of teenagers moving with the liquid purposelessness of teenagers who weren't quite sure what they wanted to do, but were committed to doing it together. Adrian walked the main path toward the duck pond, which was in the park's northern section and had a small wooden bridge and a rusted metal fence along one edge that the city had been repainting with impressive irregularity for years. He saw her before she saw him. Lillian was standing at the edge of the pond in a dark blue coat, her hair longer than he remembered, holding a paper bag that was presumably full of bread or whatever you fed ducks. She was looking at the water. Her posture was the same as it had always been. Straight, composed, the kind of posture that looked effortless and wasn't. Beside her was the boy. Caleb was wearing a red jacket and rubber boots with frogs on them and was currently engaged in the urgent and apparently demanding task of throwing pieces of bread at the ducks, not to the ducks, with the physical commitment of someone who had a personal grievance to settle with waterfowl. He was narrating something. Adrian could hear the sound of a child's voice, not the words yet, just the sound. and Lillian was listening to whatever he was saying with the particular attention of a mother who has learned to track two things at once. Adrian stopped walking. He was 30 feet away, maybe 35, and he stood on the path, and he looked at his son, and the thing that happened in his chest was not describable in any vocabulary he had available to him. It was not a feeling he'd felt before. It was larger than what he was able to hold, and it was his own fault. And both of those things were true simultaneously, and there was nothing to do with either of them except stand there and feel it. Caleb turned to say something to his mother, and in doing so turned far enough that his face came into partial profile, and Adrian saw the jaw, the brow, his own face looking out of a 6-year-old boy in rubber boots with frogs on them. He walked forward. Lillian heard his footsteps, or maybe sensed the change in the air around her, because she turned before he reached her. Her eyes found him, and something moved across her face. Not surprise, she'd known he might come, she'd issued the invitation. But something more complicated than surprise, a kind of bracing. The look of a woman who has prepared for a moment and is discovering that preparation only goes so far. "You came," she said. "Yeah." His voice came out lower than he intended. He stopped a few feet from her. "Yeah, I came." She looked at him the way you look at someone you used to know better than anyone and now don't know how to look at. "How are you?" "Lillian." He said her name because he didn't have the next sentence yet. She nodded. She understood what the name meant in the absence of the sentence. "I know." Caleb had noticed that his mother had stopped paying attention to his bread-throwing operation and had turned around to investigate. He looked at Adrian with the frank, uncomplicated assessment of a child who hasn't yet learned to dress his observations up in social courtesy. "Who are you?" he asked. Adrian crouched down. He didn't plan it, it just happened, the way some physical things happen when the body makes a decision before the brain catches up. He was eye level with his son, who had Lillian's coloring and his own face and breadcrumbs on his red jacket, and was looking at him with an expression of genuinely interested inquiry. "My name is Adrian," he said. Caleb thought about this. "Do you know my mom?" "I do. We knew each other a long time ago." Caleb weighed this information. He glanced at Lillian, who gave him a small nod, and then looked back at Adrian. "Do you like ducks?" Adrian felt something crack open somewhere in the vicinity of his sternum. "I don't know them very well," he said, "but I'm open to it." Caleb appeared to find this a satisfactory answer. He held out a piece of bread. "You can throw some," he offered, with the generosity of a person who considers this a significant gift. Adrian took the bread. He stood up. He looked at Lillian, who was watching him with an expression he couldn't read and suspected was doing a great deal of work to remain unreadable. Her eyes were bright in a way that was not tears but was adjacent to tears. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. "Thank you for—" He stopped. Started again. "Thank you for telling me." "I should have told you sooner." "You had reasons." "I did." She turned to look at the pond. "Doesn't mean they were all the right ones." They stood side by side while Caleb conducted his ongoing campaign against the ducks, and the silence between them was the most complicated silence Adrian had ever stood in, which was saying something because he had sat across from CEOs during hostile negotiations and hadn't found the quiet half as difficult to occupy. "He asked about you," Lillian said, without looking at him. "Not you specifically. He doesn't know yet, but he asked if his dad knew he existed when he was 4. She paused. "He said he would want to know." The bread in Adrian's hand was getting soft from the cold air. He threw it at the pond. A duck got it immediately, and the other ducks redirected with the ruthless single-mindedness of creatures who understood exactly what mattered. Caleb made a triumphant sound. "You're good at it." "Beginner's luck," Adrian said. Caleb threw his next piece twice as hard, apparently deciding that if this stranger could succeed, then he was going to succeed harder. The piece sailed over the ducks entirely. Caleb frowned with intense professional displeasure. "I see he's competitive," Adrian said quietly, to Lillian. Lillian's mouth did something complicated. Not quite a smile. Something older than a smile. "I wonder where he gets that from." They walked after the bread ran out. Not together, exactly. Caleb ran ahead, and then doubled back and then ran ahead again in the way that children navigate space when they're not required to stay beside anyone. like a small satellite with an eccentric orbit. Lillian and Adrian walked at a pace that was technically together while maintaining a distance that was technically several inches wider than comfortable. "I need to know something," Adrian said. "All right." "When you decided not to tell me," he kept his voice level, "was it because you thought I wouldn't care, or because you knew I would?" The question sat in the air between them. Lillian walked 3 steps before she answered. "I thought," she said carefully, "that if I told you, you would do the right thing. And I thought the right thing, the way you would have done it, would have been worse for him than nothing." "What does that mean?" "It means I thought you'd show up out of obligation. I thought you'd put in the appearance. I thought you'd be physically present and emotionally somewhere on the 41st floor. And Caleb would grow up knowing his father was in the room but not quite there. And I decided that was—" She stopped. "What?" "I decided that was worse than not having you at all." She said it without cruelty. She said it like a woman stating a medical fact about a wound she'd already cleaned and bandaged. "I grew up with a father who was technically present. I know what that looks like from the inside." Adrian was quiet for a long moment. Caleb had found a stick and was dragging it along the metal fence, producing a rhythmic clattering that echoed. "You didn't give me the chance to be different," Adrian said. "No," Lillian agreed. "I didn't. That wasn't—" He stopped himself, started again. "Lillian, that wasn't your decision to make alone. I know that. He's my son." "I know that too. I've missed 6 years." The words came out rougher than he intended, the managed composure slipping in a way he noticed and couldn't correct. 6 years of his life that I am never— He stopped again, his jaw tightened. "I can't get those back." "No," Lillian said quietly. "You can't." The matter-of-fact plainness of it was somehow worse than if she'd argued with him or gotten defensive. She just agreed. 6 years, gone, not coming back. Yes, that was accurate. She was aware. "So what do we do?" he said. Not quite a question. Lillian stopped walking. Adrian stopped beside her. Caleb was 20 feet ahead, completely absorbed in his stick and the fence, providing a running auditory commentary to no one in particular. "I'll tell you what I'm not going to do," Lillian said. "I'm not going to make decisions about Caleb's life based on what's easiest for either of us. What I told you in the letter, that's what I meant. You want to be in his life, you can try. But Adrian—" She turned to look at him directly, and the thing in her eyes was not anger and was not grief, but was something older and harder than either, something that had been sitting in her chest for 6 years and had turned to stone in the process. "If you come into his life and then leave again, if you let him start to need you, and then you decide this is too much or too complicated or whatever it is you decide, I'm not going to do that. You don't know what you're going to do. Neither do I. What I know is that he is 6 years old and he has no defenses and he will love you completely and without conditions the moment you give him a reason to, because that's how he is. That's how he loves everything and everyone. And if you break that—" Her voice went tight and held. "If you break him, I will not forgive you, not in this lifetime." Adrian met her eyes. "I understand." "Do you?" "Yes." He said it quietly and without performance, which was, she would realize later, the thing that made her actually believe him even against her better judgment. They stood in the cold morning air while Caleb continued his investigation of the fence. "He doesn't know who you are yet," Lillian said. "Not today. It's too much for today. But I'll tell him. If you're serious about this, I'll tell him, and we'll figure out what comes next." "Okay. It's not going to be neat. I know. You are going to do things wrong. You're going to not understand how he works, and you're going to say the wrong thing sometimes. And there's going to be a learning curve, and I need you to commit to going through the learning curve instead of shutting down when it's uncomfortable." "Lillian, I need to hear you say it." He looked at her. At the woman he'd signed away on a Wednesday morning in a lawyer's office with his expensive pen and his managed composure and his absolute certainty that he was moving towards something better. He looked at what the 6 years had done to her face. Not aged it exactly, but densified it, given it a weight it hadn't had, the weight of someone who had learned things the hard way and now carried the knowledge of them everywhere. She was still herself, entirely, unmistakably herself. "I'll go through it," he said. "All of it, whatever it takes." Caleb had circled back and was now standing between them, stick in hand, looking up at Adrian with renewed interest. "Do you have kids?" he asked. The silence lasted 1 second, maybe 2. Lillian drew a breath. Adrian looked down at his son and felt the word, yes, rise in his chest with an intensity that almost knocked the breath out of him, and he held it there, the word and the truth, because it was not his moment to release it. It wasn't right yet. Lillian had said not today. Not yet, he said, and immediately understood that was the wrong answer too, but there was no right answer available, so he took the wrong one and held it. Caleb accepted this with a shrug. "Do you want to see the other pond? There's a bigger one on the other side. The ducks there are meaner." "That sounds," Adrian said carefully, "like exactly where I want to go." Caleb grabbed his hand. No hesitation, no negotiation, no request for permission. Simply grabbed his hand the way children grab hands when they've decided someone is worth taking somewhere, and started walking. Adrian did not move for exactly 1 second because the physical reality of that small hand around his fingers was something he had not, in any of his preparation or lack of preparation for this morning, fully anticipated. Then he walked. Lillian fell into step behind them. She watched the back of Adrian's head, his shoulders inside the gray sweater, her son's red jacket moving at his side, Caleb's mouth already going about the mean ducks and the size discrepancy and the political situation among the various duck factions of the two ponds, and she felt something in her chest that she did not name because naming it felt dangerous, felt like the kind of move that could cost her something she hadn't finished paying for yet. She watched them walk. She thought, this is either the best thing I have ever done or the beginning of something I will not survive. He called her that evening. She picked up on the third ring. "I want to tell him," Adrian said. No preamble. "Not yet, I'm not saying now, but I want to be there when you do. I want him to know from both of us. I don't want him to find out the way I found out, in an envelope, alone." He stopped. Can we do it that way?" Lillian sat at her kitchen table with the lamp on and the rest of the apartment quiet because Caleb was asleep. She had a cup of tea. She had spent the 3 hours since getting home trying to figure out what she felt about the morning, which was like trying to figure out the shape of something in the dark. You could tell it was there. You could tell it was large, but the specific contours were still unclear. "Yes," she said. "We can do it that way." Silence on the line. "Lillian." His voice was different than it had been in the lawyer's office, different than it had been across the park. It was the voice she used to know before he learned to manage it. "I'm sorry I know that doesn't cover it. I know sorry doesn't touch it, but I need to say it anyway." She closed her eyes. "I know," she said. "What do I do?" He asked it plainly, without the executive composure, without the managed distance. Just a man asking a question he didn't know the answer to. "Where do I start?" She thought about Bev in the break room, 2 cups of bad coffee, and a fluorescent light, and the most useful thing anyone said to her during the pregnancy. "You start by showing up," she said. "You show up, and you keep showing up, and you don't stop when it's hard. That's it. That's the whole thing." A long pause. "Okay," he said, and then quieter. "I can do that." She didn't tell him she wasn't sure she believed him yet. She didn't tell him about the thing that had happened in her chest, watching him walk her son to the other pond, or about the 3 hours she'd spent trying to identify it in the dark. She said goodnight, and she hung up, and she sat at the table for a while longer with her tea going cold. Down the hall, Caleb slept in his room with the nightlight on, and his stuffed dog, and his drawing of a rocket ship taped to the wall. The second rocket ship, the one they'd built stronger, the one that had held. Lillian sat at the table and thought about what she'd started with that padded mailer and that 3-paragraph letter, and whether there was any version of the next year that was going to be anything other than the most difficult thing she'd ever done. She couldn't find one. She turned off the lamp and went to bed anyway, because Caleb would be awake at 6:15 regardless of what she resolved, and the morning was coming whether she was ready for it. The first Sunday Adrian came to pick up Caleb, he arrived 4 minutes early. Lillian noticed because she'd been watching the clock with the focused, involuntary attention of someone waiting for test results. She heard the knock at 8:56 and stood in the kitchen for a moment with the dish towel in her hands before she put it down and went to the door. Adrian stood in the hallway in jeans and a dark jacket, holding a paper cup of coffee from the place down the street, and he looked like a man who had been awake since 5 and was running on the particular fuel of someone who has decided to be somewhere and has put everything else aside to make that happen. He looked, she thought, like he was trying very hard not to look like he was trying very hard. "Hey," he said. "Hey," she said. They stood there for a beat, in the specific social uncertainty of two people who once shared a bed and now shared a child, and were still working out what the grammar of that looked like in a doorway. "He's finishing breakfast," she said. "Come in." He came in. He stepped inside, and she watched him take in the apartment with the careful, controlled look of a man who was disciplining himself not to assess things out loud. The small living room, the bookshelf with Caleb's library books, and her teaching materials intermixed. The kitchen table with the cereal bowl and the orange juice and the drawing of what appeared to be a dinosaur fighting a robot that was taped to the refrigerator beside a school calendar and a grocery list. Caleb heard him and came barreling in from the kitchen with a piece of toast in his hand and his shoes on the wrong feet. "Your shoes," Lillian said. Caleb looked down, looked up, looked at Adrian. "I know which foot they go on," he announced in the tone of someone who deeply does not want this fact questioned. "I just put them on the other way first to see how it feels." "And?" Adrian said. "It feels the same." He took a bite of toast. "Can we go to the Science Museum? Mom said you were going somewhere today." "I thought the park again, but if you want the Science Museum has a whole section about deep-sea stuff." Caleb said this as if it were an argument that could not be countered. Adrian looked at Lillian. She gave him the slight lift of an eyebrow that said, "This is your territory now, figure it out." It was not unkind. It was informational. "Deep-sea section it is," Adrian said. Caleb made a sound of triumph and ran to fix his shoes, which he did with impressive speed and complete inaccuracy, getting them right on the second try, and then presenting himself for inspection with his jacket half-zipped and his toast still in his hand. Lillian fixed the zipper. She didn't think about it, just did it. The muscle memory of 6 years of zippers. And then she straightened up and found Adrian watching her with an expression she looked away from too quickly to fully identify. "Back by 4, she said. 4, Adrian confirmed. He was back at 3:58. That was the first Sunday. Then there was another one, and another one after that, and by the 4th Sunday, Caleb was waiting by the door at 8:45 with his jacket already zipped correctly, and his shoes on the right feet and a list he'd made, in handwriting that was technically readable if you knew the code, of things he wanted to show Adrian at wherever they were going that week. Lillian watched this and felt two things at the same time that had no business coexisting: relief and terror. The relief was straightforward. Caleb was happy. Caleb had a father who showed up and who listened to him and who did not check his phone while Caleb was talking, a detail she noticed on the second Sunday when Adrian came back and reported on the day, and she realized he had retained every single thing Caleb had said, in order, with the specificity of someone who had been paying genuine attention. The terror was also straightforward. The more Adrian showed up, the more Caleb would need him to keep showing up. The stakes were compounding with every Sunday, every science museum, every duck pond and homework session and bedtime FaceTime call that Adrian had started suggesting around week 3, in a voice that was carefully casual and that Lillian had said yes to with a similar careful casualness that didn't represent what was actually happening in her chest. What was happening in her chest was something she was not looking at directly. She talked to her sister Diane on a Tuesday evening in November, 3 weeks into the new arrangement, sitting on the couch with her grading in her lap and the phone against her shoulder. "So he just shows up," Diane said. "Every week. On time. Early, actually." A pause. "How's Caleb?" "Diane." Lillian put the pen down. "Caleb thinks this is the greatest development of his life. He made Adrian a card, with stickers." "A card for what?" "Just a card. A This Is For You card. He drew them at the Science Museum." Silence on Diane's end that was doing several things at once. "How are you?" Diane asked. "I'm fine." "Lillian." "I'm managing." "That's not the same thing." "I know it's not the same thing. I'm managing, and I'll let you know when it becomes something else." Diane let this go with the practiced reluctance of an older sister who knew when pushing would not help. "He's not going to keep it up," she said then quietly. "Men like Adrian." "Diane, don't." "I'm just saying, I know what you're saying. I've been saying it to myself since the park. Lillian looked at the dinosaur versus robot drawing that was still on the refrigerator, visible from the couch. But Caleb is happy, and Adrian is showing up, and right now those are the only facts I'm working with. She heard Diane exhale. Okay, her sister said. Okay, just be careful. I'm always careful. No, Diane said. You're always brave. That's different. 3 weeks after that phone call, the careful structure Lillian had built cracked down the middle. It happened on a Wednesday, which was not a Sunday, which was the first anomaly. Her phone buzzed at 2:15 in the afternoon while she was in the middle of a read aloud with her second graders, and she ignored it because she was in the middle of a read aloud. And then it buzzed again, and then again, and she had the specific parental instinct that makes you know before you know. So she made a 30-second excuse to her class and stepped into the hallway. 3 missed calls from Caleb's school. She called back while walking toward the main office. Mrs. Hayes, this is the front desk at Elmwood Primary. I'm a teacher here. What happened? Caleb had a fall on the playground. He's in the nurse's office. He's okay, but she was already moving. Caleb was sitting on the padded cot in the nurse's office with an ice pack held to his left wrist, and a look on his face that was working very hard to be brave about the fact that his wrist clearly hurt a great deal. His right cheek was scraped. His knees had the particular damp darkness of jeans that had met asphalt. Hey, bud. She sat down beside him and took his face gently in both hands and looked at him, and did the full rapid survey that 6 years of motherhood had made into a kind of internal diagnostic. Scrape on cheek, not deep. Wrist, potentially more serious. Knees, superficial. Eyes, alert, no dilation. I fell off the climbing thing, he said. I can see that. My wrist feels weird. She looked at the wrist, at the way he was holding it, at the angle. We're going to get it looked at. Is it broken? I don't know yet. Probably not. He jutted his chin slightly forward in the way he did when he was in pain, but had decided that showing the full extent of the pain was not in keeping with his personal standards. He had been doing this since he was 3 years old, and it wrecked her every time. Mom. Yeah. Can you call Adrian? She looked at him. He was looking at the ice pack. I can call him, she said carefully. He's probably at work. I know. He turned the ice pack over. I want him to know. She called Adrian from the hallway outside the nurse's office. He picked up on the second ring, and she could hear background noise, voices, a meeting she'd interrupted, and she said, It's Lillian. Caleb took a fall at school. We're headed to the ER to check his wrist. And before she finished the sentence, the background noise was already reducing. Footsteps, a door, Adrian's voice saying something to someone else in the room that she couldn't make out, and then just his voice directly. Which hospital? You don't have to... Which hospital, Lillian? She told him. He was there before they finished triage. She came out of the check-in area with Caleb beside her, Caleb still carrying the ice pack with the solemn responsibility of someone transporting something important. And Adrian was standing at the waiting room entrance in his work jacket, with his tie loosened and his sleeves pushed up, and an expression on his face that was trying to be calm and succeeding at about 60%. Caleb saw him, and something in his small body shifted, the fraction of held tension that he'd been carrying since the fall released, visibly, the way a string goes slack. Hey man, Adrian said, crouching down. He looked at the wrist, at the cheek. His jaw moved. He kept his voice very even. Tell me what happened. I was at the top of the climbing thing, Caleb said, and I slipped, and I tried to grab the bar, but I missed it. He frowned. I was almost at the top. Almost at the top is impressive. I've been at the top before. I was going for speed. Noted. Adrian stood up and looked at Lillian over Caleb's head, and the look between them was brief and specific, and carried an entire conversation in about 3 seconds, the way looks do between two people who have started to calibrate to each other whether they intend to or not. They sat together in the waiting room for an hour and 40 minutes. Adrian bought Caleb apple juice from the vending machine and let him choose the channel on the waiting room TV, which resulted in 20 minutes of a nature documentary about deep-sea creatures that Caleb watched with the fixed intensity of a scientist confirming a theory. When the nurse called them back, Lillian started to say something about how Adrian didn't need to come. It came out of old habit, the reflex of a woman who had been the only adult in every medical waiting room for 6 years. And Adrian looked at her and said simply, I'd like to come in. And Lillian stepped aside. The wrist was not broken. A mild sprain, an ace bandage, instructions to rest it and use ice. Back to school tomorrow, if he felt up to it. In the car in the hospital parking garage, while Caleb dozed against the window in the back seat, crashing from the adrenaline of the fall and the excitement of the ER, or in the nature documentary, Lillian sat in the passenger seat and said nothing for a moment. "Thank you," she said finally. "Don't," Adrian said. Not harshly, just directly. "Don't thank me for that. That's just what you do." She looked out the windshield at the concrete geometry of the parking garage. "I know," she said. The problem arrived in December, and it arrived in the form of a man named Marcus Webb. Lillian had known Marcus for 2 years. He was a parent at Elmwood, his daughter Emma, in a different second-grade class. And he had started talking to Lillian at a school fundraiser 18 months earlier in the way that a person talks when they are interested but are being respectful about the pace of things. He was a good man. She believed that sincerely. A high school history teacher, divorced, Emma's primary custodian, the kind of person who remembered the things you told him and asked about them the next time he saw you. He had been patient with a consistency that Lillian recognized as real rather than strategic, and in November she had finally agreed to dinner, which had been good, and then a second dinner, which had also been good, and she had been quietly exploring the question of what this was and what she wanted it to be when Adrian Mercer had arrived in her life again like a geological event and rearranged the topography entirely. Marcus did not know about Adrian yet. She hadn't told him because she hadn't known how to explain something she wasn't sure she understood herself. She told him on a Saturday in December, 3 weeks after the hospital parking garage, over coffee at the place near her apartment that she used for conversations she needed a neutral location for. She told him about the divorce, which he already knew parts of. She told him about Caleb's father coming back into the picture. She watched his face while she explained, and she saw the thing happen in his eyes that she had been afraid would happen. Not anger, Marcus was not an angry man, but a particular settling, the way a person looks when they are recalibrating their understanding of a situation. "How long has he been back?" Marcus asked. "About 2 months." Marcus turned his coffee cup in a circle on the table. "And how is that going?" "He's showing up for Caleb," she said. "That's what matters." "Right." He turned the cup again. "And for you?" She looked at him. "Marcus, I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm asking how you are." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm trying to figure out what's good for Caleb and I'm not good at doing that and also sorting out what's happening with me at the same time. I don't have enough bandwidth for both, and right now Caleb comes first." He nodded. He was quiet for a while. Then, "Where does that leave us?" It was a fair question. It was the right question. She looked at this decent, patient man across the table and felt a genuine and specific regret for the answer she was about to give him. "I don't know," she said. "I need time." He picked up his cup, put it down without drinking. "Okay," he said. "I'll give you time." He said it without resentment, which she found harder to bear than if he'd been angry. "But Lillian, I'm going to need you to be honest with yourself about what's happening. Not with me. I'm not asking you to report back, but with yourself." She drove home after that and sat in the parking lot, not the grocery store this time, her own parking lot, and she thought about what being honest with herself would actually require, and she decided she needed approximately 48 more hours before she was prepared to do it. The call came on a Thursday evening in the second week of December at 9:17 p.m. from a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer. "Is this Lillian Hayes?" "Yes." "My name is Renata Voss." A pause. "I'm calling about Adrian Mercer." Lillian's hand tightened on the phone. "Okay. I was seeing Adrian up until about 2 months ago." Another pause, carefully timed. "I thought you should know some things." The woman's voice was controlled and precise, each word placed with the deliberateness of someone who had rehearsed this, but was also genuinely angry under the rehearsal, the two things coexisting the way a fire coexists with the structure it's burning through. "I'm listening," Lillian said. She stood up from the couch and walked into the kitchen because she needed to be standing. "Adrian told me about you," Renata said, "and about your son. About 2 weeks after he came to see you at the park. He told me he needed to, that things needed to change, that he had responsibilities he hadn't known about. Her voice thinned slightly. He ended things between us in a conversation that lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes to end something that had been going on for 18 months. Lillian stood at the kitchen counter. She was looking at the refrigerator, the dinosaur drawing, the grocery list. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it, the way you mean it about someone else's pain, even when you're already calculating what this pain is about to mean for your own situation. "I don't want your sympathy," Renata said. "I want you to understand what kind of man you're dealing with. Tell me." He does this. The anger was closer to the surface now, the rehearsal cracking. He invests in something while it suits him, and when the stakes get too high or the situation gets too complicated, he reorganizes. He makes a decision, very cleanly and very efficiently, and the thing that no longer fits his plan stops existing for him. You know what that looks like from the inside, don't you? You were married to him. Lillian said nothing. "He is not back for your son," Renata said. "Or maybe he is. I can't say that for certain. But I can tell you that Adrian Mercer does not change. I watched him for 18 months. I watched him be brilliant and attentive and present, right up until the moment when something more important came along, and then the switch flipped and you are simply no longer in the picture." Her voice went flat. "I'm not calling to be vindictive. I'm calling because I would have wanted someone to call me." The line went quiet. "How did you get my number?" Lillian asked. Her voice was very steady, which was not how she felt. "He has a file. When he's managing a situation, he makes a file. I found mine once by accident. There were notes about conversations, about decisions he'd made, he had written down the things I'd told him, things I considered personal, alongside assessments of whether they were relevant to whatever he was managing." A pause. "There was a section about you, about the situation with your son. It was clinical, very organized. He wrote down the outcomes he was planning for." Lillian's jaw tightened. "What outcomes?" "I don't know specifically. I didn't read the whole thing, but there were numbers, legal terms, things about custody arrangements and financial structuring." Renata paused. "I don't know what he's planning. I just know that when Adrian Mercer decides to manage a situation, the other people involved don't always find out until it's already been managed." The call ended 2 minutes later, after Renata had declined Lillian's offer to exchange numbers and said something that sounded like, "Just be careful," and hung up. Lillian stood at the kitchen counter for a long time. She put the phone down. She picked it up again. She put it down. The person she wanted to call was Diane. The person she wanted to call was Bev. The person she wanted to call, and this was the thing she was not willing to look at yet, was Adrian, because she wanted to hear him deny it in his actual voice, where she could read the micro-expressions and the breath patterns and the tells she'd spent 7 years learning and had never entirely forgotten. Instead, she sat at the kitchen table and she thought. She thought about the file, the word clinical and the word structured, and the phrase outcomes he was planning for. She thought about Adrian at the hospital, sleeves rolled up, 60% calm. She thought about the way Caleb had released the held tension in his body when he saw Adrian in the waiting room, that specific slackening, and she thought about what it would do to a 7-year-old boy if that happened, and then unmistakably happened in reverse. She thought about the word custody, about financial structuring, about the investment executive who had built a firm by identifying what distressed situations actually needed and making plans other people hadn't foreseen. She thought, what if I am the distressed situation? She thought, what if I have already been managed and just don't know it yet? And then she did something she hadn't done in 2 months of Sundays and science museums and hospital parking garages and FaceTime calls about deep-sea creatures. She went to her laptop and she searched, with the specific and shaking efficiency of a woman looking for a thing she is afraid she will find, for any legal filings, any family court activity, any attorney correspondence, anything in the public record connected to the name Adrian Mercer and the words custody or paternity. She found nothing, which meant either there was nothing or it hadn't been filed yet. She closed the laptop. She sat in the apartment that held 6 years of her son's life, the drawings, the books, the rocket ship drawn by a small hand on the wall above his bed that she'd never quite been able to bring herself to paint over. And she thought about what she'd set in motion with that padded mailer and that 3-paragraph letter. and whether she had handed the most important thing in her life to a man who had spent 41 years learning how to hold things right up until they became inconvenient. She called Adrian at 10:41 p.m. He picked up immediately. "Hey, everything okay?" Just the sound of his voice, immediate, present, no irritation at the late hour, made the thing in her chest more complicated, not less. "I need to ask you something," she said. "Okay. And I need you to tell me the truth. Not the managed version of the truth, not the version that makes the most strategic sense, the actual truth." A beat. She heard him shift, heard the quality of his attention change, heard the thing in his breathing that she recognized as him getting very still. "Right," he said. "Have you talked to a lawyer about Caleb, about custody?" The silence lasted 3 seconds. She counted. "Lillian, yes or no?" Another second. "Yes," he said. The word hit her chest like a closed fist. "I called Kellerman," he said quickly, 3 weeks ago, because I needed to understand my legal position. I needed to know what my rights were. I wasn't planning to— Stop. Her voice came out flat and cold and very unlike how she usually spoke to him, unlike how she'd spoken to him in 2 months of careful, painful, cautiously rebuilding Sunday mornings. "You were investigating your legal options." "I was getting information. I wasn't filing anything." "While you were coming to the park and taking him to the science museum and showing up at the hospital." Her voice cracked on the last word and she forced it back because she was not going to cry on this phone call. She had made that deal with herself 4 years ago, and it held. "While Caleb was making you cards with stickers, Lillian, I wasn't planning to do anything. I needed to understand what I was entitled to because I didn't know. I had no frame of reference. You are entitled to what I decide to give you," she said, and the coldness in her own voice frightened her slightly. "That is the only entitlement you have. I have been his parent for 6 years without your name on a single document, and you have been in his life for 8 weeks, and you were talking to a lawyer. I wasn't doing it against you." "How do I know that?" "Because I'm telling you. You were keeping it from me." "Yes," he said it plainly. "I was keeping it from you because I knew how it would sound, and I was trying to figure out whether it was necessary before I brought it into an already— You don't get to manage what I know and when I know it." The words came out precise and hard, and each one cost her something she wasn't sure she could afford. "I have been making decisions about Caleb's life since before he was born. I have been the only adult in his corner since before he was born. You do not get to investigate your legal position in secret and also ask me to trust you." Silence. "Who told you?" Adrian said. Quiet. Not accusatory, just asking. She thought about Renata Voss's voice, the controlled precision, the crack in the rehearsal. "It doesn't matter who told me," she said. "It matters to me." "That is not my problem right now, Adrian." She could hear him breathing, could hear him thinking, could hear, and this was the thing that made the whole conversation more complicated and not less, that he was not getting defensive or corporate or managing the situation into something more palatable. He was just sitting in it, breathing in it, taking the full weight of it without deflecting. "What do you need from me?" he said finally. "I need you to understand that if you ever go around me on anything related to Caleb again, anything, any conversation with any lawyer about any aspect of his life that affects us both, you will lose access to him so fast you will not see it coming." "I understand." "I don't think you fully understand what I'm capable of when it comes to protecting him." "I believe you," he said. And then, more quietly, "I'm sorry, Lillian. I handled it wrong. I was scared, and I handled it wrong." "Scared of what?" A pause. "Of not having any ground to stand on, of being dependent on your goodwill entirely, of not knowing whether if something changed between us you could just—" He stopped. "I know that's not an excuse. I know it came out badly. I was trying to protect myself in a situation where I didn't know the rules, and I did it the way I always do, which is privately and without telling anyone, and I was wrong." Lillian sat at the table. The apartment was quiet around her. She thought about what it meant that his worst impulse under pressure was to gather information in secret, and she thought about what it meant that he'd admitted it without a single layer of executive management, and she thought about Caleb asleep down the hall and the rocket ship drawing on his wall, and the sticker card currently sitting on Adrian's refrigerator, which she knew about because Caleb had asked whether Adrian had put it up yet. and she had called to ask, and Adrian had said yes, center of the refrigerator, with a particular quality in his voice that she had not let herself analyze at the time. She thought, this is the moment. This is the moment where he is exactly who I was afraid he was, and also possibly, terrifyingly, more than that. She thought, I do not know how to do this. I have never known how to do this. I have just been doing it anyway for 6 years because there was no other option. I need you not to call me again tonight, she said. I need to think. Okay. And Adrian. She pressed her palm flat against the table. If you ever, for any reason, for any fear, for any self-protective instinct, if you ever put your own comfort before Caleb's safety, if you make a legal move without telling me, if you do one single thing that treats my son like a situation to be managed, you will not get another chance. There won't be a conversation. There won't be an explanation. You will simply be gone from his life, and you will have done it to yourself. A long silence. I hear you, he said. She hung up. She put the phone face down on the table and she pressed both hands flat against the wood, and she breathed carefully, in and out, the way you breathe when you are preventing something from becoming a larger thing than you currently have the capacity to hold. Down the hall, Caleb slept. The nightlight made a small orange glow under his door. She had started something she could not now unstart, with a man she could not now fully trust and could not entirely dismiss, and was connected to through the most important person in her life, in a way that had no clean resolution and never would. And she was going to have to decide in the next few days, in the next few conversations, whether what she had seen in the park and in the hospital and in 8 weeks of Sunday mornings was real, or whether Renata Voss was right and she had let herself be managed by the one man she should have known better than to let in. She sat at the table until midnight. Then she got up, checked the lock on the front door, turned off the kitchen light, and walked down the hall to Caleb's room, where she stood in the doorway for a moment watching her son breathe in the small orange glow, his stuffed dog tucked under his arm, his bandaged wrist resting on top of the blanket, his face completely undefended in the way that sleeping children's faces are, open and trusting and entirely unaware that the ground beneath the life she'd built for him had just shifted in a way that was going. He called at 7:15 the next morning. She let it ring. He called again at 7:40. She was standing at the kitchen making Caleb's lunch, peanut butter and the strawberry jam, not the grape. The grape had been a diplomatic incident 2 weeks ago, and she heard the buzzing on the counter and she looked at his name on the screen and she finished making the sandwich and cut it diagonally the way Caleb preferred and put it in the bag before she picked up the phone. She did not call him back. She drove Caleb to school. She sat through a full day of second grade, spelling, reading groups, a math lesson about place value that went sideways when one of her students decided that the manipulatives were more interesting as projectiles. And she held the professional self together with the practice of 6 years, because her students needed her present, and she was not the kind of teacher who let her personal life bleed through the classroom door. At 3:15, she picked Caleb up. He talked the entire drive home about a boy named Devin, who had brought an actual dead beetle in a jar for show and tell, and the class's various reactions to this, which ranged from scientific fascination to one girl named Prue absolutely losing her composure, and Lillian laughed at the right places and asked the right questions, and felt the conversation like a rope she was holding on to. She fed him dinner. She helped him with his reading homework. She gave him a bath. She read him 2 chapters of the book they were on, something about a mouse with improbable adventures. And when she turned off the light and came out into the hallway, she stood there for a moment with her back against the wall and her eyes closed. Then she picked up her phone and called Adrian back. He answered before the first ring finished. "I'm not going to pretend last night didn't happen," she said, "and I'm not ready to have the full conversation yet, but I need to know one thing. Ask. Is Caleb safe with you? I don't mean physically. I mean, are you in this for him, or are you in this for what you think you're owed?" A long pause. Not the kind of pause of someone constructing an answer. The kind of pause of someone trying to be sure the answer they have is the honest one. "He's safe with me," Adrian said. "I swear to you on every—" He stopped. "He's the only thing I'm certain about right now. Everything else I've handled badly. He's the one thing I'm not willing to handle badly." She stood in the hallway. "Okay," she said. "Can I see him this Sunday?" "Yes." "And you and I—" "Not yet," she said. "Give me some time." "Okay." A beat. "Lillian." I'm going to fix this. That's not something you get to just decide, she said. It's not a deal you can close. You don't get to put a number on it and optimize your way to the other side. She heard her own voice and the exhaustion in it, and did not try to remove it. You fix it by showing up and being honest and giving me time to figure out whether what you are now is actually different from what you were then. That's it. That's all of it. He said nothing for a moment. I can do that, he said finally. She went to bed at 10:30 and slept, for the first time in 3 days, in the dense and dreamless way of someone whose body has decided enough is enough. Sunday came. Adrian came. He and Caleb went to the park with the mean ducks, which had apparently become a standing engagement, and Lillian spent 3 hours cleaning the apartment with the particular intensity of a woman who is not cleaning so much as managing the excess pressure of a situation she cannot currently resolve through conversation. She was on her knees cleaning behind the toilet, the last refuge of domestic stress displacement, when her phone buzzed on the bathroom floor with a text from Marcus. No pressure, just checking in. Hope things are okay. She sat back on her heels. She thought about Marcus Webb, who remembered what she told him, who was patient without motive, who had looked at her across a coffee table and told her to be honest with herself. She thought about sitting across from him and seeing his face recalibrate. She thought about what it meant that the main thing she'd felt in that coffee shop was a specific, complicated regret that she was not fully ready to name. She texted back, I'm okay. Complicated couple of weeks. Can we talk soon? He responded within 2 minutes. Whenever you're ready. She put the phone down and finished the bathroom. The crisis that Adrian had been managing at Mercer Capital Group, the one Ray Okafor had been carefully not asking him about since October, broke open on a Monday morning in the 3rd week of December. It was a real estate investment trust, a mid-tier fund called Palomar that the firm had restructured 18 months earlier and placed in a portfolio that was, on paper, solid. The paper, it turned out, had been maintained by a senior associate named Derek Chun, who had been smoothing certain numbers with the optimistic creativity of someone who believed the market would correct before anyone noticed it hadn't. The market had not corrected. Derek Chun was currently not answering his phone, and the investors, 3 of them institutional, were on a conference call at 11 a.m. that Adrian had approximately 2 hours to prepare for. Ray came into Adrian's office at 9:47 and closed the door and said, How bad? Bad, Adrian said. He was standing at his desk with 3 files open and his jacket off and his sleeves already rolled up. Not catastrophic if we move fast. What do you need? I need you to find Chun. Working on it. I need the Palomar original documents from 18 months ago. Greta's pulling them. And I need someone to call the institutional clients before the 11 o'clock and get ahead of the narrative before they arrive at it themselves. Ray looked at him. That's you. I know it's me. Adrian picked up his phone. How are you on the legal side? Kellerman is already looped in. Kellerman. The name landed with a small, specific weight. Adrian felt it and kept moving because there was nothing else to do when a situation was detonating except move. He called the first institutional client at 10:03. He called the second at 10:19. He called the third at 10:31, and that call was the hardest because the contact on the other end, a woman named Patricia Bloom, who managed a pension fund and therefore had approximately 0 tolerance for financial creativity, asked him flat out whether this was negligence or fraud. And he said, with the honesty that was the only tool available to him, I don't know yet. I'm telling you everything I know right now in real time, and I'm going to keep doing that until we have the full picture. Patricia Bloom said nothing for a moment and then said, That's the right call, Mercer. Don't stop doing it. And hung up. The 11 o'clock call lasted 90 minutes. Adrian ran it. He presented what they knew, what they didn't know, what the firm was doing about the gap between those two things, and what the realistic outcome scenarios looked like. He was not reassuring in the sense of making things sound better than they were. He was reassuring in the sense of being the steadiest person in the room, which was the only kind of reassurance that actually held up. Afterward, Ray stood in the corridor outside the conference room and looked at him. You doing okay? Ray asked. Yeah. You look like you haven't slept. I've slept. He paused. Not great, but I've slept. He picked up his jacket from where he'd thrown it over a chair. I need to make a call. Ray nodded, which was the right response, and went to deal with the next thing on the list, because there was always a next thing. Adrian called Lillian from the corridor at 1:14 p.m. "Hey," she said. "Everything okay?" "Work situation. It's being managed." He paused. "I have a question." "Okay. This Sunday. Is there any chance, I know it's not on the schedule, but is there any chance I could do Saturday as well? I need—" He stopped. "I know that's not the arrangement." Silence on her end. He could hear the background sounds of her classroom being cleaned up, chairs scraping, the distant voices of kids in the corridor. "What happened?" she said. "Work. I'm going to be in the middle of a crisis all week, and I don't know how much of the weekend it'll take, and The thing he couldn't say was, "I need to know I have somewhere real to be on the other side of it." He was aware that was too much to say. He said instead, "I don't want to miss the scheduled Sunday if the crisis runs long." Another pause. "Saturday afternoon," she said. 2:00. You can take him to the park. But Adrian, if something comes up with work on Saturday, I need you to call me in advance. Not a last-minute text, a call." "Understood. And we still need to have the conversation. About the lawyer." "I know. Soon." "Yes." She hung up. He stood in the corridor with his phone against his chest for a moment, and then he went back into the controlled detonation of the Palomar situation, and he worked through the afternoon with the focused attention of someone who had spent 20 years learning how to be useful inside a crisis. And at 6:15 he called Caleb on FaceTime because it was Monday, and they'd started doing that on Mondays and Wednesdays. No particular reason except that Caleb had asked, and the asking had been one of the things that had done something irreparable to Adrian's capacity for managed distance. Caleb appeared on the screen with what appeared to be clay on his right hand, and a look of considerable satisfaction. "What did you make?" Adrian asked. "A horse, but it looks more like a dog. But I'm saying it's a horse." Artistic intention matters. "That's what I said." Caleb turned the clay object toward the camera. It was, objectively, not clearly either thing. "I think the legs are the problem. Legs are hard. Everything has legs. You'd think I would know how to make them by now." "How many legs does your horse have?" Caleb counted with one finger on the clay. 7. "That might be the problem." Caleb looked at the horse. He appeared to give this serious consideration. "I think it's more interesting with 7. Adrian sat in his office with the Palomar files spread around him and his jacket off and the city going dark outside the window, and he felt, looking at his son's clay horse with its 7 legs and its confident creator, that whatever the week was about to cost him, it was worth it. That the thing on the other side of the cost was worth any price, and this was either the truest thing he'd ever understood or he was more tired than he thought. Both, probably. The conversation with Lillian happened on Friday evening. She came to his apartment. That was her decision. She called Thursday and said she preferred neutral-ish territory, which his apartment was more than hers, because his apartment didn't have Caleb's drawings on the refrigerator and she needed to be able to think clearly. He had understood immediately and said come whenever was good. She arrived at 7. He had not done anything to the apartment to make it more presentable because doing that would have felt like performance, and he was very tired of performance. She sat on the couch. He sat in the chair across from it. He'd offered coffee, and she'd declined, and they'd sat for a moment in the particular quiet of two people who have a large amount to say and are trying to find the correct entrance. "Tell me about the lawyer conversation," she said. "From the beginning. What you asked, what Kellerman said, what you were considering." He told her. He told her without editing, which was harder than it should have been, because editing was the thing he defaulted to without thinking, the reflex of 20 years in a business where information was power and you managed its distribution carefully. He overrode the reflex. He told her he'd called Kellerman in late October, 5 weeks after the park, because he'd woken at 3 in the morning with the specific fear of a man who has discovered he has a son and has no legal standing whatsoever, and had imagined, in the 4 a.m. logic of sleep-deprived anxiety, every scenario in which Lillian could decide to move, or restrict access, or simply change her mind. And he had called Kellerman the next morning from a place of fear, and the call had lasted 20 minutes, and he had not pursued anything further after that. "He told you what your options were," Lillian said. "He outlined them, yes. And I decided I wasn't going to pursue any of them." He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Because I understood that anything I did through a court was going to blow up exactly what I was trying to build with both of you. And because He stopped. Say it. Because you were right. 8 weeks in, I had no standing to demand anything. I hadn't earned anything. He looked at her directly. That call was me being afraid and stupid, in that order. Lillian had her hands wrapped around a glass of water he'd gotten her at some point. She was looking at a spot on the floor between them. The woman who called me, she said. Renata. His jaw tightened. What did she tell you? She said you kept a file about managing situations, that she found one about herself. Lillian looked up. She said there was a section about me. The silence was about 4 seconds long. There was a file, he said. I keep notes. It's how I process things. I have notebooks for everything. You know that. Adrian. The section about you was... He stopped. He pressed his fingers against his forehead, a gesture she hadn't seen from him in years, the tell of a man running out of managed vocabulary. I was trying to think through the situation, what was happening, what might happen, what I needed to understand. It wasn't a strategy document. It wasn't a plan against you. But it was clinical. Yes. The word cost him something. Yes, it was clinical, because that's how my brain works when I'm scared. I systematize, I organize. I try to understand the variables because understanding the variables makes me feel like I have some control over what's happening. He looked at her. That is a terrible way to respond to human relationships, and I know it, and I have been aware of it for years, and it is apparently still what I do when I'm at the end of my coping resources. The apartment was quiet. Outside, the city was doing its indifferent thing. She wasn't wrong to call me, Lillian said. No, she wasn't. She was hurt. She was. He sat back. I ended things badly. I ended them because I knew that what I was trying to do here, with Caleb, with you, couldn't coexist with what we had, and I made the decision and executed it, and I did not handle her as a person. I handled her as a variable in a situation. Lillian set the water glass down on the coffee table. Adrian. Her voice was careful, precise. I need to ask you something, and I need the real answer. Okay. Why are you doing this? She held his eyes. Not Caleb. I believe you about Caleb. I think that's real. But this, coming here, the FaceTime calls and the Mondays and the Wednesdays, and showing up at the hospital. She paused. What is it that you're actually trying to get back? The question sat in the air between them. He felt it land in the exact place she'd aimed it. He'd asked himself the question. In the early mornings, in the office corridor, on the 41st floor with the commanding view. He'd asked it with the systematic attention he brought to things he was afraid of, and he'd gotten the same answer each time, and had been afraid of that answer too, which was why he hadn't said it out loud yet to anyone, including himself in a direct and unmanaged way. I'm not trying to get anything back, he said. I'm trying to understand what I threw away, and whether... He stopped. His hands were flat on his knees. 7 years ago, I sat in a room and I signed papers because I had convinced myself that what we had was holding me back. I believed that. I was wrong about it in a way that I didn't understand until I stood in a park and my 6-year-old son grabbed my hand. He looked down at his own hand, open on his knee. I'm not here to reclaim something. I'm here because being around you and Caleb is the only time in the last 2 months when I have felt like I know what I'm actually supposed to be doing with my life. And I am aware that is not something you asked to carry for me. Lillian looked at him for a long time. No, she said quietly. It's not. I know. I have a life, she said. I built it without you. There are people in it, there are things in it that I didn't put on hold waiting for you to figure this out. She paused. There was someone. A correction he heard. Marcus, she said. We were. I don't know what we are right now. Adrian said nothing for a moment. He felt the word land and stay there. He filed no reaction away. He simply felt it, which was not something he was good at, and which the last 3 months had been forcibly teaching him. What does he mean to you? Adrian said. He's a good man. That's not what I asked. She looked at the water glass. He's a good man who was interested in me and patient with me and didn't require me to explain everything from the beginning, and I don't know what I feel about him because the last 2 months have not been a good time for me to know what I feel about anything. She looked up. I'm telling you this because you told me about Kellerman, and I'm trying to operate on the same terms. I appreciate that. It doesn't mean anything. I know. About us. I know, Lillian. She picked up the water glass. Set it down again. What I need from you, she said, is not a declaration and not a plan and not a file. I need you to keep showing up for Caleb. I need you to be honest with me when you're scared instead of systematizing the fear into a legal consultation. And I need... She paused, and the pause had the quality of someone saying something they've been holding for a long time. I need you to understand that I am not a situation to be managed. I am a person who made a very painful decision 6 years ago and has lived with it every day since, and I need to be treated accordingly. You're right, he said. No addition, no qualification. She looked at him. He looked back. Okay, she said finally. She stood up. She picked up her coat from the arm of the couch. I should get home. Diane's with Caleb. He stood. He walked her to the door. She put her coat on and picked up her bag, and for a moment they stood in the narrow space of the doorway, and he was close enough that he could see the tiredness in her face, and the thing beneath the tiredness that was not tiredness but something more durable. Adrian, she said. Yeah. I don't know what this is. I don't know what it's going to be. I need you to be okay with not knowing for a while. I'm okay with it, he said. She looked at him steadily. Don't tell me what I want to hear. I'm not. He met her eyes. I've spent 20 years deciding what I want and going after it in a straight line. I don't know how to do this slowly, but I'm learning. He paused. I think slow might be the only way this works. She held his gaze for one more moment, then she nodded. Once. She went out the door and he listened to her footsteps going down the hall, and he stood in his doorway for a moment after she'd gone and thought about the word slow and what it required, which was something he had always treated as a weakness and was only now beginning to understand was a different kind of strength entirely. The crisis with Palomar collapsed and was rebuilt over the next 10 days. Derek Chun was found in Scottsdale, apparently, which impressed no one, and the numbers were reconstructed from original documentation, and the losses, while real, were manageable in the specific way that losses become manageable when the people responsible for them are honest about their scope from the beginning. Patricia Bloom said, on the resolution call, "You handled this the right way, Mercer," which was not a compliment exactly, but was the closest Patricia Bloom came to one, and Adrian took it as such. Ray sat across from him on the afternoon of the resolution and said, "You know Chun's going to try to make this a termination dispute." "Let him," Adrian said. "We have the documentation." "Yeah." Ray was quiet for a moment. "You were different this time." "Different how?" "Crises used to sharpen you. This one," Ray considered. "This one you were sharp, but you also seemed human, like there was something you wanted to get home to." He said it without particular weight, just an observation. Adrian looked at his business partner. "I have a son," he said. It was the first time he'd said it out loud to anyone at the firm, to anyone in his professional life, to anyone other than his mother, who he'd told in November over lunch in Bethesda, in a conversation that had involved a long silence, and then Eleanor reaching across the table and gripping his hand with the focused ferocity of a woman who had a great deal she wanted to say and was exercising enormous restraint in how she said it. Ray's face went very still. "A son," Ray said. 6 years old. His name is Caleb." Adrian looked at the files on his desk. "It's complicated." "It always is." Ray paused. "Is he... He's great." The word came out with a warmth that Adrian was aware of and did not try to modulate. "He thinks his clay horse with 7 legs is superior to a conventional horse with 4. He has strong opinions about the duck politics at the park near his school. He grabbed my hand the first time I met him and walked me to the mean duck pond." He stopped. "He's great." Ray Okafor looked at his business partner for a long moment with the expression of a man who has worked alongside someone for 11 years and is seeing something in their face he has not seen before. "Good," Ray said, "just that." "That's good, Adrian." Christmas that year was the hardest thing Adrian had done since the Palomar crisis, and the Palomar crisis had involved 3 institutional investors, a missing associate, and Patricia Bloom, so that was not an insignificant comparison. Lillian's family came to the city. Diane, who spent the first hour of Christmas Eve doing everything short of running a background check on Adrian in the kitchen doorway, while he helped Caleb build a model of the solar system on the living room floor. And Lillian's mother, a small, sharp-eyed woman named Helen Hayes, who had the specific manner of a woman who had formed opinions about Adrian Mercer 7 years ago and was not fully convinced the file needed to be reopened. He'd asked Lillian whether he could come for a few hours on Christmas Eve. She had said yes. He suspected it had cost her something with Diane, who was clearly and not subtly in the camp of people who believed Lillian was being too generous, and that Adrian was a risk she was taking too casually. He brought nothing expensive. He brought Caleb a book about deep-sea creatures that he'd found at the bookstore near the office. A real one, with photographs, the kind of book you go back to. He brought Lillian flowers that were not romantic flowers, but were just flowers, yellow and unambiguous. He brought a bottle of wine for the table that was thoughtful without being a statement. Diane watched him come in with the alertness of someone monitoring an airspace. He'd known from Lillian that Diane was protective in the way of an older sister who has watched someone she loves do the work of two people for 6 years, and he had decided in advance that the appropriate response to Diane was honesty and patience, and not trying to win her over, because trying to win people over was a managed behavior. And managed behavior was exactly what had gotten him into every situation he was currently trying to get out of. He sat on the floor with Caleb, and they built Saturn's rings out of cardboard and foil with the serious collaborative focus of two people who had the same approach to projects, which was to do them properly or not at all. And at one point Caleb said, "The rings are actually made of ice," with the authority of someone sharing classified information. And Adrian said, "I did not know that." And Caleb said, "A lot of people don't," in a way that clearly communicated, "This is why you need me." At some point during this, Diane came and sat on the couch above them, ostensibly to read something on her phone, actually to observe. He was aware of her watching. He kept building Saturn's rings. "You know," Caleb said to Adrian, holding up a piece of foil, "my dad has never been to Christmas before." The room went very quiet. Helen Hayes, at the kitchen table with Lillian, went still. Diane stopped pretending to read. Adrian kept his voice level. "No, this is my first one." Caleb considered this. "Do you know how it works?" "I think I know the basics." "They're stockings," Caleb said authoritatively, "and you can't go downstairs until everyone is up, and breakfast is the special kind." He looked at the foil ring. "And you have to be patient, which I'm actually not very good at." "Me neither," Adrian said. "We can work on it together." He did not look up at Lillian. He knew she was there, in the kitchen doorway. He knew from the specific quality of the silence in that part of the room. He kept his eyes on Saturn and the foil ring and his son's hands. Later, after Caleb had been put to bed and Helen Hayes had retired to the room Lillian had set up for her, Diane cornered him in the kitchen while Lillian was in the bathroom and said, without preamble and without raising her voice, which was somehow more effective than raising it, "I need you to understand something." "Okay," he said. "She spent 4 years not sleeping. She spent 2 years working 2 jobs. She went to every school event, every doctor, every emergency, every 3 a.m. fever, by herself, and she did it without asking you for a single thing, and she did it because she is the toughest person I have ever met, and also because she loves that boy with something that has no bottom." Diane kept her eyes on him. "If you hurt him, you hurt her. And if you hurt her again, there is no version of any of this where that ends well for you." Adrian looked at Diane, at the ferocity in her face and the love under it. "I know," he said. "I don't think you do. I don't think you have any idea what she carried." "No," he agreed. "I don't. Not fully. I'm learning what it cost her, and I'm not done learning, and I don't expect to be done for a long time." He paused. "I can't fix the 6 years. I know that. I'm not trying to pretend those years didn't happen or didn't cost what they cost. I'm trying to make the next 6 years different." Diane looked at him for a long time with the analytical precision of a woman running the numbers. "You'd better," she said. Then she picked up her wine glass and walked back into the living room as Lillian came out of the bathroom, and Lillian looked between them with the expression of someone who knows exactly what conversation just happened and is choosing not to ask. "Saturn looks good," Lillian said, looking at the solar system model on the living room table. "Caleb's very committed to scientifically accurate ring composition," Adrian said. "He's been like that since he was 3. A pause. "He asked me last week if you were going to be his dad or just his father." Adrian went still. What did you tell him? I told him that was up to both of you. She looked at him steadily. What's the answer? He thought about the 4-second silence on the phone when she'd asked about Kellerman. He thought about how the honest answer was always the one that cost you something. Both, he said. If he'll let me. I want to be both. Lillian held his gaze. Outside, the city was quiet with the specific quiet of Christmas Eve, and inside the apartment the solar system sat on the table with Saturn's scientifically accurate rings, and Caleb slept down the hall with his stuffed dog and his sticker collection agenda and the particular blind faith of a child who had decided, with no supporting evidence except instinct, that the man who showed up at his duck pond was. The answer to Caleb's question lived in Adrian's chest for 3 days before he did anything with it. Both. He wanted to be both. The father on the documents and the dad on the floor building Saturn's rings. He had said it to Lillian on Christmas Eve with the solar system on the table and the city quiet outside and Diane watching from the other room with the focused vigilance of someone who has already decided to be unimpressed but is finding the evidence more complicated than expected. He had said it and meant it, and then driven home through streets emptied by the holiday and sat in his apartment and felt the weight of what meaning it actually required. He called his mother the next morning. Eleanor picked up on the second ring. Merry Christmas, sweetheart. Merry Christmas. He was standing at the window. The commanding view was white at the edges with a light frost on the glass. Mom, I need to tell you something I should have told you 2 months ago. He heard her set something down. A cup, maybe. The sound of her giving him her full attention, which Lillian Hayes gave to very few things, and which, when she gave it, felt like a physical weight. He told her about Caleb, not the compressed version he'd given Ray, not the managed executive summary. The full version. The package, the photograph, the park, the rubber boots with the frogs, the 7-legged clay horse, the Christmas Eve floor, and Saturn's rings, and the answer he'd given Lillian in the kitchen doorway. He told her about the lawyer call and the crisis with Palomar and Renata Voss, and the conversation on the couch where he'd finally stopped editing himself long enough to say something real. Eleanor was quiet through most of it. He heard her breathing. He heard, at one point, the particular quality of silence that meant she was composing herself rather than responding. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I want to meet him, she said. I know. Soon. I know, Mom. Adrian. Her voice had the thing in it that it only had when she was using the last of her diplomatic reserves. I love you, I have always loved you, but I need you to hear me when I tell you that what you're describing, the file, the lawyer, the managed distance, that is your father's son talking, and you have spent your whole life trying not to be your father's son. A pause. This is the moment, right now. This is where you choose. He thought about his father, a man who had been brilliant and present and entirely unreachable at the same time, a man who had built things of considerable value and left people who loved him feeling like variables in a larger equation. He thought about how much of himself he had understood through that lens without ever saying it out loud. I know, he said. Don't just know it. Do something different. I am. Do more. He exhaled. I love you. I know you do. Now go be the father that boy deserves. A pause. Bring him to Bethesda. Robert will make his chili. Caleb will love the chili. He smiled, which felt strange and also exactly right. Okay. January. Don't make me wait until February. January, he agreed. He hung up and stood at the window for a while longer. The frost on the glass caught the morning light. Below him the city was beginning to wake from its Christmas quiet, and he stood there with his palm flat against the cold glass and thought about being his father's son and choosing otherwise, and about how the choosing was not a single moment but a daily thing, a Wednesday afternoon thing, a 3 a.m. fever thing, and I was wrong and I am telling you thing that had to be repeated indefinitely or it didn't count. Understood that now, in a way, he had not understood anything, at 29 signing papers with a matte black pen. He got dressed and drove to Lillian's. She opened the door in her robe with coffee in her hand and Caleb's voice audible from inside, making the specific sound of a child who has been awake for at least 2 hours and has thoroughly exhausted every independent activity and is now in need of an audience. She looked at Adrian on her doorstep at 8:40 in the morning on Christmas Day. I should have called, he said. Yes. I'm sorry. I just. He stopped. I wanted to be here. If that's. I can go. She looked at him for a moment in the particular way she'd been looking at him for the last month, the way of someone reading a document they've read many times and are checking for the thing that will eventually change. You can stay for breakfast, she said, but next time you call first. Next time I call first, he agreed. She stepped back. He came in. Caleb erupted from the living room like a small, flannel-pajamed force of nature, stopped dead when he saw Adrian, and then said, with the elaborate casualness of someone trying to conceal excitement, "Oh, you're here. I'm here. Do you want to see what I got?" "I absolutely want to see what you got." What Caleb got was, among other things, a telescope. It was secondhand, a good one, the kind you could actually use, that Lillian had found and cleaned and set up in the corner of his room with the instructions bookmarked. Caleb led Adrian to it with the proprietary confidence of a scientist showing a colleague his laboratory, and spent 45 minutes explaining what he planned to look at once it got dark enough, which was everything, in a specific order he had already determined and written down in a notebook. Adrian sat on the edge of Caleb's bed and listened to all of it. He noticed the rocket ship drawing on the wall. The second one, Lillian had told him, made stronger after the first one fell apart. He looked at the small, careful lines of it, the deliberate reinforcements, the handwriting in the corner that said Rocket Ship 2 in block letters, and he thought about what it meant to build the second version instead of giving up. And he looked at his son pointing at the labeled parts of the telescope instructions, and he felt the 6 years not as an absence exactly, but as a weight he was going to carry in a specific part of his chest for the rest of his life. And that was right, and it was supposed to feel exactly like that, and he wasn't going to try to put it anywhere else. January arrived with the particular cruelty of a month that follows a holiday and offers nothing in return. The city was gray and purposeful, and the Palomar aftermath was still generating paperwork that landed on Greta's desk daily, and Eleanor's chili dinner was scheduled for the third Saturday, which was soon enough that Adrian had to tell Caleb in advance, which meant he had to tell Lillian first. He told her on a Tuesday FaceTime call. He had started joining the Monday and Wednesday Caleb calls when Lillian was available and staying on afterward for a few minutes to coordinate the week, which had evolved from logistical necessity into something with a different texture that neither of them was addressing directly yet. "My mother wants to meet him," he said, after Caleb had gone to brush his teeth. "I know." She was in the kitchen. He could see the refrigerator behind her with the drawings. The dinosaur versus robot picture had been joined by a new one, a solar system with the rings labeled. "I've been expecting this. Third Saturday, her house in Bethesda. She's making her partner's chili, which I'm told is going to settle this whole thing in Caleb's favor." "And me?" Lillian said. "Am I included in this invitation?" "Yes, if you want to be. I'm not asking you to do anything for my benefit. She just..." He paused. "She wants to understand the whole picture. She's 71 years old, and she doesn't do anything halfway." Lillian was quiet for a moment. "She's going to have opinions about me," she said. "She's going to have opinions about everything. She has opinions about the weather. She has opinions about the font on street signs." A pause. "She's also going to love Caleb in a way that is going to make your head spin. She doesn't have grandchildren. I think she has been waiting for Caleb without knowing she was waiting for him." Lillian looked at the camera. At him. "Okay," she said. "Third Saturday." Eleanor Hayes opened the front door of the Bethesda house before they'd finished walking up the path. She was smaller than Lillian had expected and sharper than the smallness suggested. A narrow-shouldered woman in her 70s with gray hair, cut short and brown eyes that moved over Lillian and then Caleb with the rapid, assessing intelligence of someone taking inventory. Then Eleanor looked at Caleb, really looked at him, the jaw, the brow, the 7 years of Adrian face on a 7-year-old boy in his good jacket. And something happened in her expression that was enormous and brief, and then carefully recontained, the way a person blinks when the light changes. "You must be Caleb," she said. "Yes," Caleb said. "Are you the grandmother?" "I am." He considered this. "I haven't had one of those before. I have a Grandma Helen, but she's far away." "Well," Eleanor said, "now you have one closer." She held out her hand very formally, and Caleb shook it with matching formality, and Adrian, watching from the path, felt something crack open in his chest in the same place it had cracked in the park on a Saturday morning in October. Robert appeared behind Eleanor. Quiet, decent. Robert, exactly as advertised, who shook Caleb's hand and said, "I hear you know a lot about deep-sea creatures." And Caleb immediately confirmed this with enthusiasm. And Robert said, "I've got a book about the Pacific Trench you might find interesting." And Caleb turned to Lillian and said, "This is already a good house," with the flat certainty of someone issuing a verdict. And Lillian laughed. A real one, the surprised kind, the kind that didn't have any management in it. And that was the moment Adrian knew they were going to be all right. Not perfectly, not without cost, but all right in the deep and durable way that mattered. Eleanor pulled Lillian aside in the kitchen while the chili was on, and Caleb and Robert were doing something with the Pacific Trench book in the study, and Adrian was pretending to help but actually listening from the doorway. "I owe you an apology," Eleanor said. She was stirring something on the stove and did not look away from it. Not on his behalf. On behalf of the situation. Adrian was raised by a man who treated the people who loved him as logistics. I spent 20 years trying to teach Adrian a different way, and I'm not sure I did well enough. She looked up. "You raised that boy alone. You made that decision for reasons I can understand, even if they cost my son something he can't get back. And you reached out when you didn't have to." She put the spoon down. "I'm not going to tell you what to do about Adrian. That's your life. But I want you to know that whatever you decide, Caleb has a grandmother, and that doesn't change." Lillian stood in Eleanor's kitchen and felt something she hadn't felt since before the divorce, the specific relief of being seen by someone who didn't need her to explain herself. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me. Come eat chili." Eleanor picked up the spoon again. Robert made it too spicy, but nobody tells him because he's very proud of it. The full conversation between Lillian and Adrian, the one about Marcus, the one about the file, the one about what the next year might look like, happened in February. Not on a Sunday, not on a FaceTime call with Caleb in the background. On a Thursday evening when Caleb was at a sleepover and Lillian texted Adrian and said, "Can you come over with no other context?" He was there in 22 minutes. She had wine open on the table and she poured him a glass without asking, and they sat down and she said, "I ended things with Marcus." Adrian was quiet. "I ended them 2 weeks ago," she said. "Not because of you. I want to be clear about that. I ended them because I wasn't being honest with myself about what I felt, and he deserved better than that." She looked at her glass. "He was gracious about it. He said he understood. He probably understood better than I did." "I'm sorry," Adrian said. "No, you're not." She said it without cruelty, just accurately. He looked at his glass. "No, I'm not sorry he's gone. I'm sorry it cost you something." "It did." She turned the glass in her hands. "He was a good man, and I hurt him by not being clear about what was happening in my own head, and I don't feel good about that." "What was happening in your head?" She looked up at him. "You know what was happening." "I want to hear you say it." "Why?" "Because you've been asking me to say things out loud for 4 months, and I think we should operate on the same terms." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she exhaled through her nose, a small sound of someone conceding a point. "I couldn't decide whether what I was feeling was real or whether it was just muscle memory from 7 years of loving you. Whether I was responding to who you are now or who I remember you being before the managed distance took over." She set the glass down. "I've been trying to figure out if there's a difference." "And?" "There is a difference." She said it carefully. "Who you were then was someone I loved with the kind of love you have when you're young enough to think love is enough on its own. Who you are now is..." She paused. "More complicated. Worse in some ways, better in others, harder to dismiss." "Harder to dismiss," he repeated. "That's not a declaration, Adrian." "I know." He looked at her. "What is it?" "It's me telling you that the door isn't closed." She picked up her glass again. "It's me telling you that I need more time to trust that what I'm seeing is real, and not a function of wanting it to be real. And it's me asking you if you can live with that." He thought about what Eleanor had said. "Don't just know it, do something different." "Yes," he said, "I can live with that. Even if it takes a year. Even then. Even if I decide Lillian," he set his glass down. "I spent 7 years treating you like a variable. I spent 6 years being someone's absence without knowing it. I'm not going to rush you. I'm not going to manage this into something more convenient for my timeline. He held her eyes. Take whatever time you need. I'm going to be here. Not because I'm waiting for something, because being here is what I should be doing, with or without the rest of it. She looked at him for a long time in the particular way she'd been looking at him since October, reading the document, checking for the thing that would eventually change, looking for the place where the executive composure would reassert itself and the managed distance would come back like a tide. She didn't find it. What she found was a man sitting in her kitchen at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night with his sleeves rolled up and his face open in a way she hadn't seen since before ambition calcified it. And the tiredness around his eyes was not the tiredness of a man performing patience, but of a man who was actually doing the difficult, unrewarded work of becoming something better than he'd been. Okay, she said, just that. But it meant more than it had meant the previous time she'd said it, and they both knew it. Spring came in the way. Spring comes after a long winter, not all at once, not dramatically, but in incremental and slightly improbable degrees of warmth, one afternoon at a time. Caleb turned 7 in May with a party at Lillian's apartment that involved 6 classmates, a game involving balloons that rapidly became a liability issue, and a cake that Caleb had specifically requested be shaped like a deep-sea creature, which the bakery had interpreted loosely as a blue oval with tentative fins. Adrian was there. He stood in the kitchen with Lillian while the party generated its particular controlled chaos in the living room, and they passed things back and forth, plates, napkins, the juice boxes that the children consumed at a rate that suggested they were storing it for winter, with the wordless efficiency of 2 people who had been moving around each other long enough to know the other's spatial patterns. At one point, Lillian reached past him for the paper towels, and their hands crossed in the brief, accidental contact of kitchen logistics, and neither of them addressed it, and neither of them moved away faster than necessary. Eleanor came to the party. She sat at the kitchen table with Lillian Hayes, who had driven up from Baltimore specifically for this birthday, and who had, over the last 3 months, achieved a tentative rapprochement with Adrian based primarily on the evidence of his behavior rather than any declaration of intent. And the 2 grandmothers occupied the kitchen table with the particular authority of women who have outlasted a great deal and intend to outlast more. At one point, Lillian Hayes looked at Adrian across the kitchen and said, in the direct manner she had apparently decided to deploy rather than store, "You know she worked 2 jobs." "Yes, ma'am," he said, "for 2 years." "I know." Helen studied him. "Good," she said finally. "You should know." And she went back to her coffee, which appeared to be the entirety of what she intended to say, and which was enough. Caleb blew out 7 candles. He made a wish that he refused to disclose on the grounds that disclosure would neutralize it, a position he held with the firmness of scientific principle. He ate cake and opened presents, and at one point sat in the middle of the living room floor surrounded by wrapping paper and looked up at the room. His mother, his father, his grandmothers, the accumulated and improbable population of his birthday party, with the uncomplicated satisfaction of a child who has exactly what he needs in the space he's standing in. Adrian saw the look. He kept it in the specific part of his chest where he kept the things he was not going to misplace. The question of what Adrian and Lillian were to each other resolved itself not in a conversation or a declaration, but in a Tuesday in September, 10 months after the park, and the rubber boots, and the mean ducks, and the beginning of everything. Caleb had a fever. Not dramatic, not hospital level, not the 3 a.m. emergency variety. Just the grinding, miserable 101 that keeps a child home from school and drapes itself over an entire day, like wet weather. Lillian had a parent-teacher conference she couldn't reschedule, 3 of them back-to-back in the afternoon, and she called Adrian at 8:15 and said, "Can you come?" And he was there at 9:03 with soup from the place near his office that Caleb had identified as superior to all other soups during a previous illness, and children's acetaminophen, and the Pacific Trench book borrowed from Robert's study on the last visit to Bethesda. Lillian handed Caleb off at the door with his temperature written on a piece of paper and instructions that were specific and maternal and slightly more numerous than strictly necessary because she was leaving her sick child, and that never felt okay regardless of the circumstances. "He has a preference," she said at the end of the instructions, "for who sits on the left side of the bed when someone's reading to him." "Which side?" "Left. Don't ask. It's a whole thing." She left. Adrian sat with Caleb through the morning. He read from the Pacific Trench book. Caleb corrected him twice on pronunciation and once on a factual claim about bioluminescence that turned out to be accurate, which Adrian acknowledged without defensiveness. And he heated the soup and monitored the temperature, and at one point sat on the floor next to the bed when Caleb said he felt sick and held the bowl while Caleb didn't end up needing it but wanted someone close just in case. And they sat on the floor together for 20 minutes not saying anything, Caleb's back against the bed and Adrian's back against the wall, in the specific silence of two people who are comfortable enough with each other to not fill it. At noon, Caleb fell asleep. Adrian stayed in the chair. He had his laptop and he worked on the quarterly numbers in the quiet of his son's room, where the rocket ship drawing was still on the wall and the telescope stood in the corner and 7 birthday cards were arranged on the dresser with the careful curatorial sensibility of a child who considers his possessions exhibitions. Lillian came home at 3:40. She stood in the doorway of Caleb's room and looked at the scene. Caleb asleep in the bed, Adrian in the chair with his laptop, the soup bowl on the nightstand, the Pacific Trench book open to a page about anglerfish. And she stood there for longer than she needed to stand there because she was letting herself see it instead of processing it. Adrian looked up. He closed the laptop. He pointed at the bed and raised his eyebrows in the silent shorthand of someone asking, "He's okay." And she nodded in the silent shorthand of yes, he's okay. And they stood in the doorway together for a moment, looking at their sleeping son with the specific, complicated piece of two people who have come to the same place from very different directions. They went to the kitchen. She poured water. He sat down at the table, her table, the one with the grocery list groove worn into the wood from years of Lillian writing lists on paper that pressed into the surface. "Thank you," she said. "Don't," he said. Not harshly, the same way he'd said it in the hospital parking garage. "That's just what you do." She sat down across from him. "Adrian." "Yeah." She looked at him across the kitchen table. The table where she'd opened the laptop and searched for legal filings at midnight, where she'd sat after Renata Voss's call with her palms flat on the wood, where she'd told Caleb that some grown-up decisions affected other people in ways they didn't see coming. The table that had been the site of most of the significant things she'd dealt with alone for 6 years. "I'm not in love with the man you were," she said carefully. "I want to be clear about that. That man is gone and I don't miss him." Adrian waited. "But I think I might be. I think what I feel about who you are now is different." She held his gaze steadily. "And I don't know what to do with that yet. But I'm done pretending I don't feel it." The kitchen was quiet. He did not move toward her. He did not manage the moment into something more efficient. He sat with it, the way she had asked him to sit with things, and let it be what it was without trying to direct it. "Okay," he said. She looked at him. "That's all you have?" "No." He put his hands flat on the table. "I have a lot. I have been trying to figure out how to say this to you for 3 months without it coming out like a closing argument." A pause. "I'm in love with you. I don't think I stopped being in love with you. I think I spent 7 years building a life that had no room for what loving you actually required, and I lost you, and I lost 6 years of him, and I have to live with that." He looked at her. "I'm not asking you to fix what I broke. I'm not asking you to fast forward. I'm telling you that what I feel is real, and it's yours to do what you want with." The afternoon light came through the kitchen window at an angle. Outside, the city moved with its indifferent persistence. Lillian looked at the man across from her. She thought about the lawyer's office and the expensive pen and the eyes that didn't come up from the page. She thought about a pharmacy bag and a purse and a 6-year-old boy in rubber boots and a satellite orbit and Saturn's rings on a Christmas Eve floor and a sick child and a Pacific Trench book and a Tuesday in September that looked like nothing from the outside and like everything from the inside. She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He turned his hand over and her fingers closed around his, and they sat like that in the kitchen while their son slept down the hall, not rushing, not declaring, just two people in a room with their hands touching and the full weight of everything they'd cost each other and everything they'd managed to build anyway held between them in the ordinary afternoon light. The proposal happened 8 months later, on a Thursday evening in Lillian's kitchen. He did not plan it the way he planned things at work. He did not have a speech prepared or a timeline mapped. He had a ring in his jacket pocket that he'd been carrying for 6 weeks because the right moment kept not being a moment. He could engineer, and he had finally understood that was the point. That the right moment was not an engineered thing. It was a Tuesday in September thing, a hands on a table thing, a showing up on a morning in Christmas thing. Caleb was doing homework at the kitchen table. Lillian was at the counter making dinner with the radio on low. Adrian was standing at the edge of the kitchen trying to help with the salad and doing a credible job of it. This was their Thursday now, this specific, undramatic, entirely ordinary Thursday. And it had been their Thursday for 4 months, and it was the best thing in his week, every week. He put down the salad tongs. Lillian turned around. He pulled the ring out of his jacket pocket. She looked at it, then at him, then at Caleb, who had looked up from his homework and was watching with the focused attention of a child who knows something significant is happening and is not going to miss it. "I'm not going to give you a speech," Adrian said. "I'm not going to tell you it's going to be perfect, because I know what I'm capable of, and perfect isn't in the catalog." He looked at her directly. "I want ordinary. I want Thursday dinners and homework at the table and the grocery list on the notepad and the conference calls I take from your living room and the arguments about what temperature the apartment should be and the mornings where nobody's fully awake yet." He paused. "I want to earn the right to be in this kitchen for the rest of my life. And I'm asking if you'll let me keep trying." The radio played something low and unidentifiable. Caleb had put his pencil down. Lillian looked at the ring. At him. At the man who had come into the park a year and a half ago with his gray sweater and his 60% calm and had taken a piece of bread from their son's hand and thrown it at the ducks, who had showed up at every subsequent thing without being asked to show up again, who had sat on the floor of a sick child's room with his back against the wall for 20 minutes, not because he was proving something, but because that was where his son needed him to be. "Yes," she said. Caleb made a sound that was somewhere between triumph and relief, the sound of a child whose investment in an outcome has just paid off, and he pushed back from the table and wrapped his arms around both of them simultaneously with the total body commitment of a 7-year-old who has decided this is the correct response. And Adrian's arms came around him, and Lillian's hand was on the back of Caleb's head, and for a moment the three of them stood in the kitchen, in the specific and unrepeatable configuration of a family that had been broken before it started and had made itself anyway. The wedding was small, 20 people. Lillian's sister cried through most of it and did not apologize. Eleanor sat beside Robert with her hand over her mouth for the first 5 minutes, and then composed herself with the practiced control of a woman who had been composing herself in public for 7 decades. Lillian Hayes sat straight and watched everything, and at one point caught Adrian's eye across the room with an expression that was not warm exactly, but was no longer the calculated assessment of a woman deciding whether a man was worth the risk. It was the expression of someone who had made her decision and was living with it. Caleb was the ring bearer. He walked down the aisle with the ring on a small pillow and the seriousness of a diplomat carrying state documents, and at one point, 3 steps from the end, looked up at his father standing at the front of the room and grinned, wide and sudden and entirely himself. And Adrian's composure did not survive the grin, and he knew it, and didn't try to retrieve it. They wrote their own vows. Adrian's were not long. He said, "I am not the man I was. I am still learning what the man I want to be looks like in practice. What I can promise you is that I will show up every day and tell you the truth, and choose this over anything else that asks me to choose. That's what I have. That's everything I have." Lillian's were 3 sentences. "You cost me something I can't get back. I'm choosing you anyway. Don't make me regret it." People laughed. Some of them cried. It was the truest thing said at any wedding any of them had attended. The years after were not neat. There were arguments, real ones, the kind that require a night apart before you can hear the other person again. There was a business crisis the following year that pulled Adrian into 70-hour weeks for 3 months, and during which Lillian sat at the kitchen table on more than one night with the specific fear of a woman who has been left before, feeling it return like weather she thought she'd outrun. He called her from the office at 10 p.m. on the worst nights, not to check in, but because he needed her voice, and she answered every time, and it was not enough, and it was also what kept both of them calibrated to what they were building. Caleb grew. He maintained strong opinions about duck politics and soup quality and bioluminescence facts, and at 9 discovered that he had his father's facility with numbers and his mother's facility with people, and that these were, in combination, a formidable set of tools that he was only beginning to understand how to use. Adrian never forgot the 6 years. He had thought, when the first year passed, that the grief of it would reduce. It didn't reduce. It became more specific. He grieved the particular things now, the first word and the first fall and the first fever and the first day of school, specific absences with specific shapes. He carried them in the place he had always carried the things he wasn't going to misplace. Sometimes Caleb would do or say something, and Adrian would catch Lillian's eye across the room and see in her face the same recognition. Here is what we lost. And they would let it sit between them without trying to resolve it, because some things don't resolve, they just become part of the load you carry, and you learn to distribute the weight. On a Saturday in October, 2 years after the wedding, Adrian stood at the edge of the duck pond at the park near the school. The mean duck pond. The one on the far side, with the rusted fence and the ducks of poor character. Caleb stood beside him, 9 years old now, too old for the rubber boots with frogs on them, wearing actual sneakers and a fleece jacket, and an expression of focused professional assessment as he evaluated the tactical situation of the bread and the ducks. Lillian sat on the bench behind them, reading something on her phone. The October light was the same, low and gold and slightly skeptical. It did the same thing to her face it had always done, the thing Adrian had been looking at for close to 12 years now, understanding more of it every year. Caleb threw a piece of bread. A duck got it. Another duck made a play for the first duck's piece, and there was a brief, undignified dispute. "They're worse than ever," Caleb said. "Same ducks," Adrian said. "They're getting meaner with age." "Some things do." Caleb threw another piece. He considered the pond with the philosophical weight of a child working something out. "Dad?" "Yeah." "Were you scared? When you came here the first time, before I knew who you were?" Adrian looked at the water. "Yeah, I was scared." "Of what?" He thought about the 35 feet he'd stood still on the path, looking at his son's profile for the first time. The thing in his chest that had no language for itself. "Of being too late," he said. "Of finding something I didn't deserve and losing it because I didn't know how to hold it right." Caleb threw the last piece of bread. The ducks went for it with their usual anarchic self-interest. "You didn't lose it," Caleb said. "No." Adrian looked at his son's profile. 9 years old, a study in familiar lines, a face he knew better now than he knew his own. "I didn't," Lillian called from the bench. "Can we go somewhere with coffee? I've been watching duck politics for 20 minutes, and I need coffee." "Mom is not a duck person," Caleb informed Adrian, in a conspiratorial tone. "I know. She pretends, but she's not." "I know that too." They walked back together across the park, the three of them, through the October light that did its low gold thing on everything it touched. And Adrian put his hand briefly on the back of Lillian's neck as he fell into step beside her, and she leaned into it for exactly 1 second before she reached up and took his hand, and they walked the rest of the way like that. Through the park they had been coming to since the beginning, which had no idea what it had